The candles inside the great hall of Ashgrove burned so bright that Elena Marsh had to blink against the glow, and for one heartbeat she believed the shine in her eyes was only light and nothing more. She stood at the center of the stone floor, in a white bonding dress, stitched with silver thread, and every wolf of the Ashgrove pack had gathered to watch her become their queen. She did not know yet that she was about to become nothing at all. Damien Ashgrove stood across from her, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark eyes catching the candlelight the way a blade catches the sun before it falls. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, ruler of 11 packs bound under one banner, and in exactly 11 minutes he was supposed to take her hand and declare her his mate before the gathered crowd. Elena had waited 3 years for this moment. She had trained, she had studied pack law, she had learned to fight so that no one could call her weak. She had done everything right. Then Damien raised his hand, and the hall went silent. "I cannot do this," he said. His voice carried across the stone floor without effort, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "I cannot bond myself to a wolf who cannot protect what is mine." A murmur rolled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Elena felt her heart drop somewhere past her feet. "Damien," she said quietly, stepping toward him. "What are you talking about?" "We have been promised to each other since your father made a deal with mine," Damien said, cutting her off without a flicker of hesitation. "A deal made when you were a child, and no one yet knew what you would become. Weak, ordinary, a wolf with no gift, no power, nothing that could stand beside a king." The words landed like stones. Elena had grown up hearing whispers about her lack of a true gift, the kind of power that ran in bloodlines and marked certain wolves as special from birth. She had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself that loyalty and courage were worth more than any gift. She had believed, foolishly, that Damien agreed with her. "You knew this about me for 3 years," she said, her voice shaking now despite her effort to keep it steady. "You knew, and you still asked for this ceremony. Why now? Why here, in front of everyone?" Damien did not answer her question. Instead, he turned his head, and Elena followed his gaze to the edge of the crowd, where her younger sister stood wrapped in a deep blue cloak, her chin lifted, her pale eyes gleaming with something that looked very much like triumph. Lyra Marsh had always been the brighter of the two sisters, the one who could summon flame from her palms before she had even lost her first baby tooth, the one their mother used to call a miracle. Elena had loved her without question, had protected her from bullies and older wolves who mocked her for her strange gift, had given up her own chance at a mentor so that Lyra could have the best trainers in the territory. She had never once imagined her sister standing at the edge of her own bonding ceremony, watching with quiet satisfaction, as everything Elena had built came apart. "Lyra has a gift that could shield this entire kingdom," Damien said, and now he was not looking at Elena at all, but at the crowd, playing to them the way a king plays to his subjects. Fire that does not burn her own skin, fire that answers her call in seconds. A kingdom with a queen like that would never fear invasion again. "What can you offer me, Elena? Loyalty, kindness, those things do not win wars." Elena felt something break inside her chest, quiet and final, like a bone snapping under too much weight. She looked at the faces around her, wolves she had known her whole life, pack members she had helped and healed and stood beside during hard winters, and she saw that none of them would speak for her. Fear kept their mouths shut. Fear of a king who had just shown, in front of everyone, exactly how easily he could discard someone who had given him everything. "You are ending this," she said slowly, forcing the words out even though her throat felt tight enough to close completely. "In front of the whole pack. You are humiliating me on purpose." "I am doing what is best for this kingdom," Damien answered. "A king cannot afford weakness beside him. I release you from our bond, Elena Marsh. You are no longer promised to the throne of Ashgrove." The formal words of rejection struck the air like a bell, and Elena felt them settle over her skin, cold and absolute. Under pack law, a public rejection could not be undone. It was not simply a broken engagement, it was a declaration that stripped her of any claim to rank, to protection, to a place within the territory at all. She had seen it happen to other wolves in other packs, always from a distance, always thinking it could never happen to her. Lyra stepped forward then, and the crowd parted for her, the way water parts for a stone, dropped into a still pond. She walked to Damien's side and placed her hand gently on his arm, and the gesture was so casual, so practiced, that Elena understood in an instant this had not happened by accident. This had been planned, perhaps for weeks, perhaps for longer. "I am sorry it happened this way," Lyra said, though her voice held no real sorrow in it, only the smooth, careful tone of someone reciting lines she had rehearsed in front of a mirror. "But you must understand, sister. Someone has to be strong enough to lead. It could not be you." Elena stared at her sister, searching her face for even a trace of the girl she had raised, the girl she had carried on her back through the forest when Lyra was too small to keep pace, the girl she had lied for, and bled for, and loved without condition. She found nothing there but cold ambition, polished and patient, the kind that had clearly been growing in the dark for a long time, while Elena had been too trusting to notice. "How long?" Elena whispered. "How long have you wanted this?" Lyra did not answer. She did not need to. Her silence was an answer in itself, and it was the cruelest one of all. Damien raised his hand again, and 2 pack guards stepped forward from the crowd. Wolves Elena recognized, wolves who had once called her friend. Neither of them met her eyes. "Escort her from the territory," Damien said, his tone flat, businesslike, as though he were arranging the removal of old furniture, rather than the exile of a woman he had promised to marry. "She is no longer welcome within Ashgrove borders." The guards moved toward her, and Elena felt panic rise in her throat, hot and sharp, but she refused to let it show on her face. She would not give this crowd the satisfaction of watching her break completely, not when Lyra was standing there so pleased with herself, not when Damien was already turning away, as though the matter were already forgotten. "I built half of what this pack has become," Elena said, loud enough now that her voice carried to every corner of the hall. "I healed your wounded after the border skirmishes. I negotiated peace with 3 neighboring territories when you were too proud to speak with them yourself. I have given this kingdom 3 years of my life, and you are throwing me out like I am nothing." Damien paused, just for a moment, and something flickered behind his eyes that might have been guilt, or might only have been irritation at being questioned in front of his people. Then it was gone, sealed away behind the same cold expression he had worn since the moment the ceremony began. "The decision is made," he said. "Take her outside the border stones. See that she does not return." The guards took her by the arms, not roughly, but firmly, the kind of grip meant to prevent resistance rather than cause harm. Elena did not fight them. She understood, even through the fog of her shock and grief, that fighting would accomplish nothing except giving Damien one more excuse to call her dangerous, unstable, unworthy. So she let them lead her out of the great hall, past the rows of silent wolves who would not look at her, past the candles that had seemed so beautiful only minutes before and now felt like they were mocking her with their warm golden light. As she passed the last row of the crowd, she caught sight of an old woman near the back, one of the pack elders, someone Elena had helped years ago when a fever swept through the eastern village. The old woman's eyes were wet, and she mouthed something Elena could not quite hear, but the shape of the words looked like "I am sorry." It was the only kindness offered to her that whole night, and it was not nearly enough to soften what was coming. The guards walked her through the torchlit paths of the pack grounds, past the training yards where she had once sparred until her knuckles bled, past the healing house, where she had spent countless nights tending to the sick and injured, past the small stone cottage that had been given to her when she first arrived in Ashgrove territory, 3 years ago now, young and hopeful, and utterly unaware of how this story would end. At the border stones, the guards released her arms. One of them, a younger wolf named Corin who had once trained alongside her, hesitated before speaking. "I am sorry, Elena," he said quietly, glancing back toward the hall as though afraid someone might overhear him showing sympathy. "This is not right. Everyone knows it is not right, but no one can go against the Alpha King." "I understand," Elena said, and she meant it, though the understanding did nothing to ease the ache spreading through her chest. "Take care of yourself, Corin." He nodded, looking as though he wanted to say more, but instead he turned and walked back toward the torchlight with his companion, leaving Elena standing alone at the border stones with nothing but the white dress on her back and the cold night air settling over her skin. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark line of forest ahead of her, the wild lands beyond Ashgrove territory, where no pack claimed protection and no laws promised safety. She thought of turning back, of finding some way to plead her case, of proving to Damien that he had made a terrible mistake. But she knew, even as the thought crossed her mind, that there was no path back into that hall that did not end in more humiliation. So instead, she turned toward the forest, lifted the hem of her ruined bonding dress, and began to walk. The trees swallowed the light of the torches behind her within minutes, and Elena found herself moving through near-total darkness, guided only by the pale moon breaking through gaps in the canopy above. She was a wolf, and her night vision was better than any human's, but even so, the forest beyond Ashgrove was unfamiliar territory, thick with underbrush and uneven ground, and she stumbled more than once over roots hidden beneath fallen leaves. She did not cry. She told herself this over and over as she walked, a small, stubborn promise repeated like a prayer. She would not cry over a man who had discarded her in front of hundreds of witnesses, who had chosen ambition over 3 years of devotion, who had let her own sister stand at his side while guards marched her out like a criminal. She would not give him that. But somewhere around midnight, alone in the dark with nothing but the sound of her own footsteps and the distant call of night birds, the promise broke, and she wept until her legs gave out beneath her, and she sank down against the base of an old oak tree, pulling her knees to her chest, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. She did not know how long she sat there, long enough that the cold worked its way through the thin fabric of her dress and settled into her bones, long enough that her tears dried on her face and left tight, uncomfortable trails across her skin, long enough that exhaustion finally began to pull at the edges of her mind, dragging her toward a sleep she did not want but could no longer resist. It was the sound of movement in the underbrush that jolted her fully awake again, every nerve in her body suddenly alert. She lifted her head and scanned the darkness around her, and her stomach turned cold when she made out shapes moving between the trees, low and quick, the unmistakable silhouettes of wolves who did not belong to any pack. Rogues. She had heard stories about rogue wolves her whole life, wolves who had been exiled from their packs, or had never belonged to one at all, wolves who survived on instinct and desperation rather than loyalty and law. They were dangerous precisely because they answered to no one, bound by no code that might have stayed their actions. And here she was, alone, exhausted, unarmed, wearing a dress that marked her clearly as someone who had recently belonged to wealth and comfort, exactly the kind of target a hungry rogue pack would not hesitate to pursue. Elena rose to her feet slowly, forcing her tired body into motion despite the ache in every muscle, and began to back away from the sound. The shapes in the trees shifted with her, tracking her movement, and she understood with a sinking certainty that they had already noticed her. That stillness would not save her now. She turned and ran. Branches tore at the fabric of her dress and scraped thin lines across her arms as she pushed through the undergrowth, her breath coming hard and fast, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that she could barely hear the sounds of pursuit behind her. She was a strong runner, faster than most wolves gave her credit for, but she had been walking for hours already, and grief and exhaustion had drained reserves of strength she desperately needed now. The ground began to slope downward, uneven and treacherous in the darkness, and Elena felt her foot catch on something, a root or a stone, she never knew which, and the world tilted sideways as she fell. Pain shot up through her ankle as she landed hard against the forest floor, and for a moment she could do nothing but lie there, stunned, trying to force air back into her lungs. The rogues closed in. She could hear them clearly now, low growls and the crunch of paws against dry leaves, and she forced herself up onto her elbows, scanning desperately for any kind of weapon, any branch or stone she might use to defend herself. Her hand closed around a heavy piece of fallen wood, just as the first shape emerged from the tree line, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight, teeth bared in a way that left no doubt about its intentions. Elena raised the branch, knowing even as she did it that it would not be enough, that she was too tired and too injured to fight off even one determined attacker, let alone the 3 or 4 shapes she could now make out, moving through the darkness around her. But she would not simply lie down and let it happen. She had lost her home, her mate, her sister, and her place in the world, all in a single night. She would not lose her life without a fight. The first rogue lunged. Pain exploded across her shoulder as claws caught her skin, and Elena swung the branch with everything she had left, feeling it connect with a solid, satisfying crack against the creature's skull. It yelped and staggered back, giving her a brief window, but 2 more shapes were already circling in from the sides, and she knew with growing despair that she could not fight all of them at once, not in her current state, not with her ankle throbbing and her strength nearly gone. She thought, in that strange suspended moment between one heartbeat and the next, of Damien standing in the candlelit hall, of Lyra's cold, satisfied smile, and she felt a flash of bitter anger cut through her fear. If this was how her story ended, torn apart in a nameless forest on the very night she was supposed to become a queen, then at least she would not go quietly. She raised the branch again, bracing herself for the next attack, when a sound cut through the darkness that made every rogue in the clearing freeze in place. A howl, deep and resonant, unlike anything Elena had ever heard before, carrying a weight and power that seemed to press down on the very air around them. The rogues exchanged uneasy glances, ears flattening against their skulls, and within seconds they were retreating back into the trees, abandoning their attack entirely, driven off by nothing more than the sound of something far more dangerous approaching. Elena's relief lasted only a moment, before a new fear took its place. Whatever had frightened off a pack of rogue wolves was surely no gentler than they had been. She struggled to sit up, gripping her makeshift weapon with a hand that would no longer stop shaking, and watched as shapes emerged from the tree line where the howl had come from. Tall shapes, moving with a controlled, deliberate grace that marked them immediately as something other than ordinary wolves. They wore dark cloaks that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it, and their eyes, when they turned toward her, glowed not gold, like an ordinary shifter's, but a pale, striking silver that seemed to catch every scrap of available light. Elena had heard stories of wolves with silver eyes, old stories, the kind mothers told their children at bedtime, about a bloodline so ancient and so powerful that most packs believed it had died out generations ago. Lycans. "She is injured," one of the cloaked figures said, a woman's voice, calm and steady, despite the tension still hanging in the clearing. "Human blood is in the air. She will not survive the night out here alone." Elena tried to speak, tried to ask who they were and what they wanted, but the adrenaline that had carried her through the last several minutes finally ran out, and the edges of her vision began to darken. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away entirely was a pair of silver eyes leaning close, studying her, with an intensity that felt like it was searching for something buried deep beneath her skin, something even Elena herself did not know was there. Then the darkness took her completely, and the forest fell silent once more, holding its secrets close, until the moment she would wake and discover that everything she thought she knew about herself was about to change forever. Elena woke to the smell of burning herbs and the soft crackle of a fire nearby, and for a moment she did not know where she was or how she had gotten there. She lay still, eyes closed, listening to the quiet murmur of voices somewhere close by, trying to piece together the fragments of memory that swam through her aching head. The hall, the candles, Damien's voice, flat and final. The forest, the rogues. Her eyes snapped open. She was lying on a narrow cot inside a stone chamber, lit by torches set into the walls, the flickering light throwing long shadows across a ceiling carved with symbols she did not recognize, spirals and jagged lines that seemed almost to move when she stared at them too long. Her shoulder throbbed where the rogue's claws had caught her, but when she reached up to touch the wound, she found it wrapped tightly in clean bandages, and the pain was far less than she expected it to be. "You are awake." Elena turned her head toward the voice and found a woman sitting on a low stool beside the cot, watching her, with an expression that was difficult to read. The woman looked to be perhaps 50 years old, though something about the way she held herself suggested an age far greater than her appearance let on. Her hair was silver, not gray with years but a true, striking silver, and her eyes held that same pale glow Elena remembered from the forest. "Where am I?" Elena asked, struggling to sit up, despite the protest from her injured shoulder. "You are safe," the woman said. "That is what matters most right now. My name is Nora. You collapsed in the forest 2 nights ago. My scouting party found you being hunted by rogues and brought you here." "2 nights?" Elena repeated, alarm creeping into her voice. "I have been unconscious for 2 nights?" Nora nodded, unbothered by Elena's alarm. "Your body needed the time. Whatever happened to you before the rogues found you took more out of you than the wound on your shoulder ever could. We have all seen it before. Grief has a way of draining a person just as thoroughly as any injury." Elena said nothing, unwilling to share the details of the humiliation she had endured with a stranger, no matter how kind that stranger's tone might be. She looked around the stone chamber instead, taking in details she had missed before: the carved symbols on the walls, the strange, cool quality of the air, the complete absence of any sound from outside that might tell her where in the world she actually was. "What is this place?" she asked finally. "This is the outer sanctuary of the Lycan territory," Nora said, and something in her voice carried a quiet pride when she spoke the name. "Few outsiders ever see it. Fewer still are welcomed inside rather than turned away at the border." The word Lycan settled over Elena with the weight of old stories, half-remembered lessons from her childhood, about a bloodline so ancient it predated even the oldest alpha packs. Wolves, who were said to be stronger, faster, and more dangerous than any ordinary shifter. Wolves, who had all but vanished from the world generations ago, after wars that no one living could clearly remember the details of anymore. "I thought the Lycans were gone," Elena said slowly. "Everyone believes your bloodline died out centuries ago." "That is exactly what we have allowed the world to believe," Nora said, a faint, knowing smile touching the corner of her mouth. "It has kept us safe for a very long time. Packs that fear you leave you alone. Packs that believe you no longer exist do not think of you at all." Elena absorbed this information slowly, her mind still foggy from sleep and injury. But a new question was already forming, one that felt more urgent than any curiosity about Lycan history. "Why did you save me?" she asked. "You could have let the rogues have me. You did not know me. You owed me nothing." Nora's expression shifted then, something careful and considering entering her pale eyes, as she studied Elena's face with new intensity. "That is a fair question," she said, "and I will give you an honest answer, though I suspect it will surprise you." She reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew a small, curved blade, and for one instant of pure panic, Elena thought she meant to use it as a weapon. But Nora simply held it out, offering the handle toward her. "I want you to cut your palm," Nora said. "Just a small cut. I promise you it is not a trick, and I promise you it will not harm you beyond a moment's sting." Elena hesitated, but something in Nora's steady gaze convinced her there was no danger here, beyond the ordinary risk of trusting a stranger. And after everything she had survived in the last 2 days, a small cut on her palm did not feel like much to fear. She took the blade and drew it lightly across her skin, watching a thin line of blood well up in its wake. Nora leaned forward, studying the wound with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle with unease, and then something extraordinary happened. The blood on Elena's palm did not simply well and drip the way ordinary blood would. Instead, for the briefest moment, it seemed to shimmer, catching the torchlight in a way that reminded Elena uncomfortably of the silver glow in Nora's own eyes. "I knew it," Nora breathed, and for the first time since Elena had woken, genuine emotion broke through the older woman's composed exterior. "I suspected it the moment my scouts described you, but I did not dare believe it until I saw it with my own eyes." "Believe what?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, fear and confusion tangling together in her chest. "What is happening to my blood?" "You carry the Lycan bloodline," Nora said. "Buried, suppressed, hidden so deeply that you likely never knew it was there at all. But it is there, Elena. It has always been there." Elena stared down at her own palm, at the thin cut already beginning to close faster than any ordinary wound should, and felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she understood about herself. Her entire life, she had been told she carried no gift, no special power, nothing that set her apart from an ordinary shifter. It was the very reason Damien had given for casting her aside, and now this stranger was telling her that not only did she possess a gift, but one so rare and so feared, that entire packs believed the bloodline itself no longer existed. "That cannot be true," Elena said, shaking her head. "I would have known. My parents would have known. Someone would have told me." "Would they?" Nora asked gently. "Think carefully, Elena. Has anything about your childhood ever felt strange to you? Moments of unusual strength that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared? Dreams that felt more like memories than imagination? A sense, perhaps, that something inside you was being held back, contained, kept from surfacing?" Elena opened her mouth to deny it, but the words caught in her throat as memories she had long dismissed began surfacing in her mind. The time she had lifted a fallen tree off a trapped hunting dog when she was only 12 years old. Strength that should have been impossible for a child her size. Strength her parents had quickly explained away as adrenaline, and then never spoken of again. The recurring dream of running through a forest under a full moon that was not the moon she had ever actually seen in the sky. A dream that had visited her since she was small, and always left her waking with an ache she could never explain. The strange numbness that sometimes crept over her during full moons, as though something inside her wanted desperately to break free but could not find the door. There was a spell, Elena said slowly, the pieces beginning to align in her mind even as her voice shook with the implications. There must have been. Someone suppressed this. Someone hid it from me on purpose. Yes, Nora said, and I believe I know who, though I will let the elders confirm it properly before I say more. For now, what matters is that you are safe. You are among people who will not fear or reject you for what you are, and you have a choice to make. What choice? Elena asked. Nora rose from her stool, moving with the same fluid, controlled grace Elena had noticed in the forest, and crossed to the narrow window carved into the stone wall, gazing out at whatever lay beyond it, with an expression Elena could not quite read. You can leave this place once you are healed, Nora said. Find a new pack willing to take in a wolf with no rank and no home. Live a quiet life far from the territory that cast you out. Try to forget everything that happened to you. Many wolves in your position would choose exactly that path, and no one here would think less of you for it. Or, Elena prompted, sensing there was more. Nora turned back to face her, and something fierce and bright had entered her silver eyes, an intensity that reminded Elena, uncomfortably, of the same look she had seen on Damien's face when he spoke of power and strength, and what a king required of the wolf beside him. Or you can stay, Nora said. You can allow us to help you understand what you truly are. You can learn to control the strength that has been sleeping inside you your whole life. It will not be easy, Elena. It may be the hardest thing you have ever done, but I have led scouting parties across 3 territories, and I have never in my life seen blood react the way yours reacted to that blade. Whatever you are capable of becoming, I believe it is something extraordinary. Elena sat in silence for a long moment, staring down at the healing cut on her palm, thinking of the hall full of candles, and the crowd that would not meet her eyes, and Damien's cold, dismissive voice declaring her unworthy of standing beside him. She thought of Lyra's satisfied smile, the casual cruelty of a sister, who had clearly been planning this betrayal for longer than Elena wanted to imagine. She thought of everything she had lost in the span of a single night, her home, her mate, her family, her place in the world. And beneath the grief and the anger, something else began to stir. Small and fragile, but undeniably present. A spark of something that felt almost like hope. Teach me, Elena said, and her voice, though quiet, did not waver. Teach me everything. Nora's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but held the same warmth a look of quiet satisfaction, and perhaps even respect. Then rest first, she said. Your body still needs to heal, and the training ahead of you will demand more from you than you have ever given anything in your life. But I will tell you this, Elena Marsh. The wolves of this territory do not judge one another by the packs we came from or the families that raised us. We judge one another by what we choose to become, and I suspect, given time, you are going to become something the world has not seen in a very long time. Over the following days, as Elena's body slowly healed under the care of the sanctuary's attendants, she began to piece together more of the Lycan history that Nora and the others shared with her in careful, measured doses. She learned that the Lycan bloodline had once ruled vast stretches of territory, feared and respected in equal measure for their strength and their fierce protection of the lands under their care. She learned that generations ago, a coalition of alpha kings, threatened by power they could not match or control, had waged a long and brutal campaign against the Lycans, driving them from their lands and forcing the survivors into hiding, scattering the bloodline so thoroughly that most of the wider shifter world had come to believe it extinct entirely. She learned that the elders who now led the hidden Lycan territory had spent decades rebuilding in secret, protecting what remained of their people, while carefully avoiding any conflict that might draw the attention of the very packs who had once nearly destroyed them. And she learned, with a chill that settled deep into her bones, that the Ashgrove bloodline, Damien's own ancestors, had been among the coalition that led that ancient campaign, their kingdom built in part on land and power, taken directly from the Lycans they had helped to hunt. The knowledge sat strangely alongside her grief, a discovery that reframed everything she thought she understood about the pack she had given 3 years of her life to. She had healed Ashgrove's wounded and negotiated peace on Ashgrove's behalf, never knowing that the very ground beneath her feet had been claimed through violence against people who, as it turned out, were far closer to her own blood than the pack she had tried so hard to belong to. On the 7th day since she had woken in the stone chamber, Nora returned with news that the sanctuary's elder council wished to see her. Elena rose from her cot, her shoulder now fully healed, her strength largely returned, and found herself unexpectedly nervous as she followed Nora through winding stone corridors, deeper into the mountain that housed the hidden territory. The council chamber, when they reached it, was larger and grander than anything Elena had seen in the sanctuary so far, a vast circular room, carved directly from the mountain's rock, its high ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with ancient tapestries, depicting battles and figures Elena did not recognize, but somehow felt she should. At the center of the room, seated in a ring of carved stone chairs, waited a group of elders, whose combined age Elena could not begin to guess, their silver eyes turning toward her in unison as she entered. At the head of the ring sat a woman, who could only be the Lycan queen, ancient and regal, her white hair braided with silver thread, her presence filling the room in a way that made Elena's instincts flatten immediately in an unconscious display of respect. The queen studied Elena for a long, silent moment before finally speaking, her voice thin with age but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "So," the queen said, "this is the blood that called out to my scouts in the forest." Elena bowed her head, unsure of the proper protocol, but understanding instinctively that respect was required here. "Your Majesty," she said, "I am grateful for the rescue, and grateful for the shelter your people have given me." "Gratitude is a fine start," the queen said, "but it is not why I have called you here." She rose slowly from her seat, moving with careful deliberation, and crossed the chamber floor, until she stood directly before Elena, studying her face with an intensity that made Elena want to look away, though she forced herself to hold the queen's gaze. "Nora tells me your blood reacted to the testing blade in a manner she has not witnessed in over 30 years of service to this territory. I would like to see it for myself." Elena extended her hand without hesitation, and the queen produced her own small blade, drawing it lightly across Elena's palm, exactly as Nora had done before. The same shimmer appeared in the fresh blood, silver light catching briefly before fading, and a murmur passed through the assembled elders, quiet but unmistakable. The queen's expression did not change, but something in her ancient eyes sharpened, focused, as though she were looking at Elena and seeing something far beyond the frightened, exhausted young woman standing before her. "Tell me your story," the queen said. "All of it, from the beginning." And so Elena did, standing in the center of that vast stone chamber, surrounded by the last remnants of a bloodline the world believed extinct, and as she spoke of the hall full of candles, of Damien's rejection, of Lyra's betrayal, of the long walk into the forest and the rogues who had nearly ended her life before Nora's scouting party arrived, she felt something inside her shifting, settling, hardening into a shape she did not yet fully understand, but somehow already recognized as the beginning of an entirely new chapter of her life. When she finished, silence held the chamber for a long moment. Then the queen turned to address her elders, her voice carrying easily across the stone room. "We have searched for the true bloodline for 3 generations," she said. "We have watched countless wolves come through these gates carrying only false hope and disappointment. And now, on the very night she was cast aside by the descendants of the family who once hunted our people to the edge of extinction, blood calls to blood and brings us exactly what we have been waiting for." She turned back to Elena, and for the first time since Elena had entered the chamber, something almost like warmth entered the queen's ancient eyes. "Elena Marsh," she said, "you came to us broken, cast out by a king who could not see what stood before him. I promise you this. By the time we are finished, he will understand precisely what he chose to throw away." The training yard sat carved into a hollow at the base of the mountain, hidden from any outside eye by walls of rock and centuries of careful concealment, and it was here, that Elena's first true lesson in Lycan strength very nearly broke her before it had properly begun. "Again," Callum said, circling her slowly, his silver eyes tracking every small shift of her weight. He was the sanctuary's chief trainer, a wolf built like a mountain himself, with scars crossing his forearms that told stories he had never once offered to share. "You are still thinking like an ordinary wolf. Your body is not ordinary anymore. Stop apologizing to it." Elena wiped sweat from her brow and forced herself back into a ready stance, her muscles trembling from exhaustion after nearly 3 hours of drills that morning alone. It had been 2 weeks since the council chamber, 2 weeks since the ancient queen had looked at her with something like purpose in her eyes and promised that Damien would come to understand exactly what he had thrown away. 2 weeks of training so relentless that Elena sometimes wondered whether her body would survive learning to become what her blood already claimed she was. "I am trying," she said through gritted teeth. "Trying is what ordinary wolves do," Callum said. "You need to stop trying and start remembering. Your blood already knows how to do this. Your mind is the only thing standing in the way." He came at her without warning, a fast, controlled strike aimed at her shoulder, and Elena's body reacted before her conscious thought caught up, twisting out of the path of his hand and countering with a motion that felt both completely unfamiliar and strangely, impossibly natural at the same time. Callum's eyes widened fractionally, the closest thing to surprise Elena had seen from him in 2 weeks of training, and he stepped back, nodding slowly. "There," he said. "That is what I have been waiting for." Elena stared down at her own hands, as though they belonged to someone else, her heart pounding, not from exertion this time, but from the strange thrill of feeling her body do something she had not consciously decided to do. In the early days of her training, every movement had felt clumsy, forced, her Lycan strength surging unpredictably, and then vanishing just as quickly, leaving her stumbling and frustrated, while Callum watched with the patient, unshakable calm of a man who had trained 100 wolves before her, and expected nothing less than eventual struggle. But something was changing. Each day the surges of strength lasted a little longer, became a little easier to summon on purpose rather than by accident. Each night, exhausted and aching in muscles she had not known existed until this training began, Elena fell asleep and dreamed again of running beneath a moon that was not quite the moon she knew, and each morning she woke feeling, for reasons she could not fully explain, a little more like herself. "Your body carries generations of memory," Nora had told her during one of their evening conversations, the two of them sharing a simple meal in the small stone room that had become Elena's quarters within the sanctuary. "The strength was suppressed, not erased. It has been waiting inside you this whole time for the chance to wake." "Why me?" Elena had asked, not for the first time. "Why was my bloodline hidden at all? If my family carried Lycan blood, why keep it secret? Why let me grow up believing I had no gift?" Nora's expression had grown careful in the way it always did when the conversation turned toward the deeper mysteries of Elena's past, the ones the elders had not yet fully explained. "That is a question for the queen," she said. "But I will tell you what I believe, for whatever it is worth. I believe someone in your family made a choice, long ago, to protect you by hiding what you were. Whether that choice was wise or not, I cannot say. But it kept you safe long enough to survive, until you found your way to us." The training continued through the following weeks, each day building on the last, and Elena found herself growing not only stronger but sharper, her senses expanding, in ways that startled her even after she had grown somewhat accustomed to the changes. She could hear conversations happening 2 chambers away through solid stone walls. She could smell the difference between fear and excitement on another wolf's skin from 20 paces. She could see clearly, in darkness so complete that, only months earlier, she would have been entirely blind. More than the physical changes, though, it was the sense of belonging that surprised her most. The wolves of the hidden Lycan territory did not care who her father had been, or what pack had raised her, or how she had been discarded by an alpha king in front of hundreds of witnesses. They cared only about the effort she put into her training, the respect she showed her fellow wolves, the steady, quiet determination that Callum had noted approvingly more than once during their sessions. She made friends among the younger Lycans training alongside her, wolves named Petra and Finn who had grown up within the hidden territory and had never known any other life. Wolves who found Elena's stories of the outside world both fascinating and faintly tragic. a reminder of everything their hidden existence had spared them from experiencing directly. In the evenings, when training finally ended and exhaustion settled comfortably over the sanctuary, the three of them would sit together near the great hearth in the common hall, and Elena would find herself laughing, for the first time since the night of her rejection, genuine laughter that surprised her with how easily it came. "You fight like you are still angry at someone," Petra observed one evening, several months into Elena's training, as the three of them nursed cups of warm tea by the fire. "Every strike carries more force than it needs to." "I am still angry at someone," Elena admitted. "The king who cast you out?" Finn asked. "Him, my sister, myself some days, for not seeing it coming sooner." Elena stared into the flames, watching them dance and shift, thinking of the candlelit hall and the crowd that would not meet her eyes. "I keep waiting for the anger to fade. It has not faded yet." "Maybe it is not meant to fade," Petra said thoughtfully. "Maybe it is meant to become something else instead." It was a full year before Callum finally told Elena she was ready to move beyond basic combat training, into the deeper lessons of Lycan discipline, the mental and spiritual control that separated an ordinary strong wolf from a true Lycan capable of leading others. It was during this second year that Elena finally learned, in a private meeting with the ancient queen, the truth of how her bloodline had been suppressed in the first place. "Your grandmother was a Lycan," the queen told her, the two of them seated together in a quiet garden chamber deep within the mountain, sunlight filtering down through a carefully hidden opening far above them. One of the last of the old bloodline to live openly among the wider shifter world, before the persecution grew too dangerous to risk. She fell in love with an ordinary wolf, your grandfather, and together, they made the difficult choice to hide her true nature entirely, fearing what might happen if the wrong pack discovered what she truly was. "And that suppression passed down to me," Elena said slowly, piecing the story together. "Through my mother, and then to me." "Yes," the queen confirmed. "A protective spell, cast with the best of intentions, meant to keep you and your mother both safe from packs who might have hunted you for your blood, the same way they once hunted the rest of us. Your grandmother believed she was protecting her family. In many ways she was right to believe it. But it also meant that neither you nor your mother ever knew the truth of what you carried inside you." Elena absorbed this quietly, thinking of her mother, gone now for several years, and wondering whether she had ever suspected the truth hidden within her own blood, whether some part of her had sensed the sleeping power, and simply chosen never to speak of it, afraid of what acknowledging it might invite into their lives. "Does my sister carry the same blood?" Elena asked, the question surfacing before she had fully decided to voice it. The queen considered this carefully before answering. "It is possible," she said. "Lycan blood does not always pass evenly between siblings. Your sister's gift, from what you have described, sounds like an ordinary shifter talent, powerful in its own right, but distinct from what runs in your veins. It is also possible the suppression spell affected her differently, or not at all. I cannot say for certain without testing her blood directly, which I suspect will not be a simple thing to arrange." Elena thought of Lyra, standing at Damien's side in the candle-lit hall, chin lifted, eyes gleaming with satisfaction, and felt the familiar knot of anger tighten in her chest once more. Whatever gift her sister carried, Elena no longer cared to understand it. What she cared about now was becoming strong enough that the betrayal of that night would never again have the power to break her. Her training intensified through the following months, moving beyond physical combat into the deeper disciplines of Lycan transformation. The ability to shift not only between human and wolf form, but into the true Lycan shape, larger and more powerful than any ordinary shifter's wolf form, a shape that most Lycans in the sanctuary could achieve only after years of dedicated practice. Elena reached it within 18 months, far faster than Callum had expected, and the first time she felt her body stretch and reshape into that towering, silver-eyed form, standing twice the height of an ordinary wolf with claws capable of tearing through solid stone. She understood at last the true scale of what had been suppressed within her for her entire life. "Careful," Callum warned her during those early transformation sessions, watching her circle the training yard in her new form, with something between pride and wariness in his scarred face. "Power like this can consume a wolf who is not prepared for it. I have seen it happen. Strength alone does not make a leader. Control does. Wisdom does. The willingness to use power only when it is truly needed, and never simply because you can." Elena took the warning seriously, working as hard on the discipline of restraint as she had once worked on the discipline of strength, understanding intuitively that the two were not opposites but partners, each one meaningless without the other. She spent long hours meditating in the mountain's quiet chambers, learning to quiet the surge of instinct that came with her new power, learning to think clearly, even when her Lycan form urged her toward pure, unrestrained force. It was during one of these meditation sessions, nearly 2 years after her arrival at the sanctuary, that Nora found her and delivered news that made Elena's careful calm shatter in an instant. "There is word from the outside world," Nora said, settling onto the stone bench beside Elena, with an expression that suggested the news was not simple. "Word concerning Ashgrove territory." Elena's heart quickened, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "What word?" "Your sister's gift has proven less stable than Damien Ashgrove believed when he chose her," Nora said carefully. "There have been incidents, fires that spread beyond her control, damage to pack property, at least one injury among the pack members caught too close when her power surged unexpectedly. The pack grows uneasy. Some whisper that the king made a poor choice on the night he cast you aside." Elena sat with this information for a long moment, surprised by the tangle of emotions it stirred within her. She had spent 2 years building a new life, a new strength, a new sense of purpose within the hidden Lycan territory, and she had told herself, more than once, that she no longer cared what happened within Ashgrove's borders. But hearing that the pack she had once served, the man who had once promised to make her his queen, was now struggling under the weight of his own choices, stirred something complicated inside her. Not quite satisfaction, not quite sympathy, something closer to a grim recognition that the universe still occasionally balanced its scales. "Do the elders know?" Elena asked. "The queen has been informed," Nora said. "She wishes to speak with you about it when you are ready." Elena found the ancient queen waiting in the same garden chamber where she had first learned the truth of her family's history, sunlight filtering down through the hidden opening above, illuminating the queen's silver hair like a crown of its own. The queen gestured for Elena to sit, studying her with the same careful, assessing gaze she always carried. "You have grown a great deal in 2 years," the queen said. "I have watched your training reports closely. Callum speaks of you with more pride than I have heard from him in decades. The council believes you are close to ready." "Ready for what?" Elena asked. "I am old, Elena," the queen said simply, without any trace of self-pity in her tone, only plain, honest acknowledgement. "Older than you likely realize, even accounting for how slowly our kind ages. I have led this territory for longer than most of the wolves within it have been alive, and I have spent those years searching for someone capable of carrying this responsibility forward once I am gone. I did not expect to find that person walking wounded out of a forest, cast aside by the very bloodline that once tried to erase us from existence. But I have watched you closely these 2 years, and I no longer have any doubt." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been fear. "Your Majesty, I have only been here 2 years. There must be wolves within this territory more prepared than I am, wolves who have trained their entire lives for—" "There are wolves who have trained longer," the queen agreed. "But training alone does not make a queen. What I have watched in you, Elena Marsh, is something rarer. A willingness to be broken completely and rebuild yourself into something stronger, without losing the compassion that made you who you were before. Strength without cruelty, power without arrogance. Those qualities cannot be taught in any amount of time. They can only be recognized when they finally appear." The chamber fell silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant trickle of water somewhere deeper in the mountain, and Elena found herself thinking not of power or vengeance, but of the frightened, heartbroken young woman who had stumbled through the forest 2 years ago, certain that her life had ended the moment Damien's rejection left her lips. She thought of everything that young woman could not have imagined then, the strength she had built, the friends she had made, the truth about her own blood that had reshaped everything she thought she understood about herself. "What would it mean," Elena asked slowly, "to accept this responsibility?" The queen's expression softened, just slightly, the closest thing to warmth Elena had seen from her since their first meeting. "It would mean carrying the weight of every wolf in this territory," she said. "It would mean protecting what remains of our bloodline, guiding it carefully back into a world that once tried to destroy it. It would mean facing, Eventually, the very packs and kings who believe our people no longer exist, and deciding what kind of ruler you intend to be when that day finally arrives. Elena thought of Damien, of the hall full of candles, of Lyra's cold satisfaction, and understood with sudden crystal clarity that this day the queen spoke of would arrive far sooner than either of them might have expected, and that when it did, she wanted to be ready. "Then teach me what remains," Elena said. "Whatever I still need to learn, I am ready to learn it." The queen studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, she rose from her seat and extended a hand toward Elena, an invitation rather than a command. "Come," she said. "There is one final test remaining before the council can name you my successor. It is not a test of strength, Elena. It is a test of everything else you have become. I believe, with everything I have witnessed these past 2 years, that you are ready to face it." The final test began at dusk, when the queen led Elena through a passage deep within the mountain that Elena had never seen before. A narrow stone corridor, lit by torches spaced so far apart that long stretches of the walk passed in near total darkness. Elena's enhanced senses guided her steadily forward, but even so, she felt a growing unease building in her chest with every step, the sense that whatever waited at the end of this passage would ask something of her that no amount of physical training could have prepared her for. "What kind of test is this?" Elena asked, her voice echoing softly against the stone walls. "The kind that cannot be explained beforehand," the queen answered, not unkindly, "only understood once you are standing inside it." The passage opened at last into a small circular chamber, empty except for a single stone basin filled with dark, still water at its center, and a ring of unlit torches surrounding it. The queen gestured for Elena to approach the basin, and as Elena drew closer, she noticed the water was not entirely still after all. Small ripples moved across its surface without any visible cause, as though something beneath the water's dark surface were shifting, waiting. "This basin has served every Lycan leader for as long as our bloodline has kept written history," the queen said, standing beside Elena now, her voice quiet and solemn in the enclosed space. "It shows the one who looks into it a vision, not of the future exactly, but of a choice they have not yet made, a moment that will test whether their character matches their strength. What you see in that water will feel entirely real while you are inside it. What you choose to do will tell the council, and more importantly, will tell you whether you are ready to lead." Elena stared down at the dark, rippling water, her reflection barely visible in its depths. "What happens if I fail?" "No one fails this test in the way you might imagine," the queen said. "There is no punishment, no rejection waiting on the other side. But if the vision shows you something about yourself that concerns me, we will simply continue your training a while longer before trying again. There is no shame in needing more time, Elena. There is only shame in refusing to look honestly at what the water shows you." Elena took a slow breath, steadying herself, and leaned forward to look into the basin. The world dissolved around her. When her vision cleared again, Elena found herself standing not in the stone chamber, but in a place that looked remarkably like the great hall of Ashgrove, though something about the light and the air felt subtly wrong, dreamlike, in a way she could not quite name. Before her stood Damien, older now, his face lined with worry, and beside him stood Lyra, her once confident expression replaced with something haunted and desperate. "Please," Damien said, and his voice held none of the cold authority Elena remembered from the night of her rejection. "The pack is dying. Lyra's gift has grown unstable beyond anything we can control. We need your help, Elena. We need your strength." Elena felt her pulse quicken, watching this vision of the man who had cast her aside, now begging for her assistance, watching her sister stand small and frightened beside him, all her earlier arrogance burned away by whatever crisis had unfolded in the years between the rejection and this moment. Part of her, a part she was not proud of, felt a fierce, satisfied pull toward simply turning away, leaving them exactly as they had once left her, giving them a taste of the abandonment she had suffered on that candlelit night. "You did not care what happened to me," Elena heard herself say within the vision, her voice cold. "Why should I care what happens to you?" "Because you are better than we were," Damien said quietly. "Because whatever I did to you, it does not have to define who you choose to become." The vision held there, suspended, waiting for Elena's response, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that this was the true heart of the test. not whether she could summon the strength to punish those who had wronged her. She had already proven that strength many times over during her training. The test was whether that strength would be guided by wisdom and compassion, or twisted into something cruel and small, by years of carefully cultivated resentment. "I will help," Elena heard herself say within the vision, and she felt the truth of the words settle into her chest even as she spoke them. "But not because I owe either of you anything. I will help because the wolves of Ashgrove, who never wronged me, deserve better than to suffer for the mistakes of their leaders. And I will help because becoming the kind of leader who turns away from suffering, simply because turning away would feel satisfying, is not the leader I choose to be." The vision dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, and Elena found herself once again standing before the stone basin, the dark water now perfectly still, her reflection clear and steady in its depths. She turned to find the queen watching her with an expression of quiet, profound satisfaction. "You saw something," the queen said. It was not a question. "I saw Damien and Lyra," Elena admitted, her voice still unsteady from the intensity of the vision. "Years from now, it seemed, begging for help, though I do not know if it was truly a vision of the future, or only a test of my character." "Perhaps both," the queen said thoughtfully. "The basin's visions are rarely simple. What did you choose?" "I chose to help," Elena said. "Not for their sake. For the sake of the wolves who never harmed me, and did not deserve to suffer for choices they did not make." The queen's silver eyes shone with something that looked remarkably like pride, and she reached out to place a hand gently on Elena's shoulder, a gesture of warmth and respect that Elena had come to associate deeply with her time within the sanctuary walls. "That is precisely the answer I hoped to hear," the queen said. "Power that seeks only revenge eventually consumes the one who wields it. Power guided by justice, by the willingness to protect even those who have wronged us when the greater good requires it. That is the power capable of leading a kingdom without destroying itself in the process. You have passed this test, Elena Marsh, and I believe you are ready." The council convened 3 days later in the great circular chamber, where Elena had first met the elders, and this time, as she entered the room, she felt the weight of every gaze turned toward her, not with the cautious curiosity of her first visit, but with something closer to anticipation, even reverence. The elders had gathered in full ceremonial dress, silver thread woven through dark robes that seemed to shimmer faintly in the torchlight, and at the center of the ring of chairs stood the ancient queen, holding in her hands a circlet of dark metal inlaid with pale silver stones that caught and held the light in a way that made Elena's breath catch when she saw it. "For 3 generations," the queen said, her voice carrying easily through the vast stone chamber, "this territory has waited for a leader capable of carrying our bloodline forward into a world that once tried to erase us entirely. We have trained wolves who showed promise. We have hoped, more times than I care to count, that we had finally found the one destined to wear this crown. Each time, something was missing." She turned to face Elena directly, holding the circlet before her with both hands. 2 years ago, my scouts found a broken, exiled wolf, collapsed in the forest beyond our borders, cast aside by the very bloodline that once hunted our people nearly to extinction. I did not know then what that wolf would become. I know now." The queen's voice softened, though it lost none of its authority. "Elena Marsh, you have trained with a discipline few in this territory have matched. You have shown strength tempered by wisdom, power guided by compassion, and a willingness to face the truth of your own heart, even when that truth was difficult to accept. The council and I are in complete agreement. There is no wolf in this territory better suited to carry our bloodline forward than you." Elena felt her throat tighten with an emotion she could not fully name. Gratitude and disbelief, and a fierce, quiet pride all tangled together, as the queen stepped forward and, with careful, deliberate movements, placed the circlet upon Elena's head. "Rise, Elena Marsh," the queen said, her voice ringing clearly through the chamber. "Queen of the Lycans, protector of our bloodline, and guardian of everything our people have fought and sacrificed to preserve." A sound rose through the chamber then, not the polite, restrained applause Elena remembered from formal Ashgrove gatherings, but something wilder and more genuine, howls rising from every wolf gathered in the room, a chorus of celebration that echoed off the stone walls and seemed to shake the very mountain itself. Elena stood at the center of it, the weight of the circlet settling against her brow, and felt something inside her shift permanently into place. the final piece of a transformation that had begun 2 years earlier, in a dark, unfamiliar forest, with nothing but a torn white dress and a broken heart. Petra and Finn found her afterward, once the formal ceremony had given way to a celebration that spilled through the sanctuary's great hall late into the night, and both of them embraced her with the easy familiarity of friends who had watched her grow from a frightened exile into the leader now standing before them. "I always knew," Finn said, grinning as he pulled back from the embrace, "from the very first day in the training yard, when you nearly broke Callum's arm trying to block his strike wrong. I told Petra you had something the rest of us did not." "You did not say that," Petra corrected, laughing. "You said she was going to get herself killed, trying too hard on her first day." "Details," Finn said, waving a hand dismissively, and Elena found herself laughing along with them. Genuine, easy laughter that felt worlds away from the grief that had once seemed like it might swallow her whole. Later that night, once the celebration had finally quieted, and most of the sanctuary had retired to rest, Elena found Nora waiting for her near the edge of the training yard, gazing up at the stars visible through a break in the mountain's rock far above. "You have come a long way," Nora said, as Elena settled beside her. "From the wolf I found bleeding and unconscious in that forest." "I could not have made this journey without you," Elena said honestly. "Without everyone here. I came to this territory with nothing left, and you gave me a home, a purpose, a family I never expected to find." Nora smiled, the expression warm and genuine in the moonlight. "That is what family is meant to do, Elena. It is a shame the family you were born into never understood that as clearly as the family you found here." Elena thought of Lyra then, of the news Nora had shared months earlier about the instability spreading through Ashgrove territory, and felt the familiar tangle of complicated emotion rise once more within her chest. She was queen now, crowned and celebrated by a people who had chosen her not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. And yet somewhere beyond these mountains, the pack that had discarded her was still standing, still ruled by the man who had chosen ambition over loyalty, still shielding the sister whose betrayal had cut deeper than any wound Elena had suffered in the forest that night. "What happens now?" Elena asked quietly. "Now that I wear this crown, what does the council expect of me?" "That depends entirely on you," Nora said. "You are queen now, Elena. The choices ahead of you are yours to make, guided by the council's counsel, but no longer bound by anyone else's decisions. You could choose to remain here, strengthening our territory, protecting what we have carefully rebuilt over these past decades. Or you could choose to step back into the world you once knew, and show it exactly what it cast aside on the night it should have known better." Elena looked up at the small patch of stars visible above the mountain, thinking of the vision she had seen in the stone basin, of Damien's desperate plea, and her own answer, chosen not out of revenge but out of a hard-won understanding of what true strength required. She thought of the wolves of Ashgrove who had never wronged her, the pack elder who had mouthed an apology as guards marched her toward exile, the countless ordinary members of that community who bore no responsibility for the choices their king had made. "I think," Elena said slowly, the decision crystallizing within her even as she spoke it aloud for the first time, "it is time the Ashgrove pack learned exactly what kind of wolf they cast into the forest that night, not out of cruelty, but because a kingdom built on the kind of corruption I witnessed in that hall cannot be allowed to continue unchecked. And I am, perhaps, the only wolf alive with both the strength and the reason to see it corrected." Nora studied her for a long moment, silver eyes reflecting the scattered starlight, and then nodded slowly, as though she had expected nothing less. "Then we will prepare you properly," she said. "A queen does not return to claim what was taken from her without allies, without strategy, without the full strength of her people standing behind her. Whatever awaits you in Ashgrove territory, Elena, you will not face it alone. Not this time." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of the circlet upon her brow settle into something that no longer felt unfamiliar, but instead felt, for the first time since that terrible night 2 years ago, entirely and completely earned. Fire tore through the eastern grain stores of Ashgrove territory just after midnight, and by the time the pack's fire teams brought the flames under control, 3 storage buildings had burned to ash, and 2 guards had been carried to the healing house, with burns along their arms and chests. Damien stood at the edge of the wreckage as dawn broke over the smoking ruins, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed with an exhaustion that had become far too familiar over the past year. It happened again while she was sleeping, his second in command. A steady older wolf named Garrick reported quietly, keeping his voice low enough that the gathered crowd of pack members would not overhear. She says she dreamed of fire and woke to find the grain stores already burning. She does not remember losing control. She never does. Damien said nothing for a long moment, staring at the blackened timber and the drifting smoke, thinking of the confident, gleaming smile Lyra had worn on the night he chose her over Elena, the promise of a gift powerful enough to shield the entire kingdom from any threat. That promise had curdled slowly over the past year into something closer to a curse, unpredictable surges of flame that struck without warning, damaging property, injuring pack members, and steadily eroding the trust that had once made Damien's rule feel unshakable. "Where is she now?" Damien asked finally. "In her quarters," Garrick said. "She would not come out to see the damage. I believe the shame of it weighs on her, my lord, more than she lets anyone see." Damien nodded slowly, though the sympathy he might once have felt for Lyra's struggle had grown thin and worn over the months, stretched too far by repeated incidents and the mounting cost of cleaning up after each one. He turned away from the smoking ruins and made his way through the pack grounds toward the central hall, aware of the eyes that followed him as he passed, wolves who no longer looked at their king with the easy confidence they once had. The great hall, when he reached it, felt colder and emptier than it once had, despite the same banners hanging from its stone walls, the same candle sconces lining its length. Damien had presided over council meetings in this hall for years, had once stood at its center on the night he ended his bond with Elena in favor of the promise Lyra represented, and lately he found himself unable to enter the space without the memory of that night pressing uncomfortably against his thoughts. He had told himself, in the weeks and months following Elena's exile, that he had made the correct decision for his kingdom, that a leader could not afford sentiment when the survival and strength of his people were at stake. He had repeated that justification to himself so many times that for a while, he had almost believed it completely. But watching Lyra's unstable gift burn through the pack's resources month after month, watching pack members who had once respected him whisper uneasily behind their hands whenever fire damaged something new, Damien had begun to wonder, quietly and reluctantly, whether he had made a catastrophic mistake. Council convened later that morning. The pack's senior wolves gathered around the long stone table at the center of the hall, and the mood in the room was tense before a single word had been spoken. Damien took his seat at the head of the table and surveyed the faces before him, noting the careful, guarded expressions that had replaced the open respect he once commanded so easily. "The grain stores are lost," Garrick began, laying out the morning's damage in his usual precise, methodical manner. "Combined with the losses from the incident 3 months ago at the eastern border post and the damage to the healing house roof in the spring, we are looking at resources this pack cannot easily replace before winter arrives. The neighboring territories will not extend further aid," added Selah, the pack's treasurer, a sharp-eyed older wolf who had served Ashgrove's finances for over a decade. "We have already called on 3 alliances this year alone. If we ask again, they will begin to wonder whether Ashgrove can be trusted to manage its own affairs." Damien absorbed this information with a tightening in his chest that he did not allow to show on his face. "What do you propose?" he asked. "Some measure of control must be placed on Lady Lyra's gift," Selah said carefully, choosing her words with the caution of someone who understood exactly how delicate this conversation had become. "Whether through further training, or through restrictions on when and where she is permitted to practice, or through some other measure the council might recommend. The pack cannot continue absorbing losses of this magnitude, my lord. Forgive my bluntness, but the treasury will not survive another year like this one." Murmurs of agreement passed around the table, quiet but unmistakable, and Damien felt the weight of it settle heavily on his shoulders. He had built his kingdom on strength and decisive leadership, and now he found himself presiding over a council that no longer trusted the very choice he had made in front of the entire pack 2 years earlier. "I will speak with her again," Damien said finally, though even as the words left his mouth, he heard how hollow they sounded. He had spoken with Lyra after every incident, had brought in every trainer within reasonable distance willing to work with a gift as volatile as hers, had spent resources and patience that grew thinner with each passing month, and still the fires came, unpredictable and destructive, a constant reminder of a promise that had never truly been fulfilled. After the council meeting concluded, Damien found Lyra in her private quarters exactly where Garrick had said she would be, sitting near the window with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at the thin trail of smoke still rising from the ruined grain stores. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment Damien saw not the confident, ambitious young woman who had stood at his side on the night of the rejection, but something closer to the frightened girl she must have been, before that gift of hers had ever manifested at all. "They blame me," Lyra said quietly, before he could speak. "I heard them talking in the hall. They think I am a danger to this pack. The council is worried about our resources," Damien said, choosing his words carefully, though the truth of Lyra's statement was not something he could honestly deny. "That is all." "That is not all, and you know it," Lyra said, her voice sharpening with an edge of desperation. "I have tried everything, Damien. Every trainer, every technique, every discipline they suggest, and still it happens. I do not know why. I cannot control it. I never asked for a gift this strong, and now everyone looks at me like I am some kind of curse. This pack has to survive." Damien said nothing for a long moment, watching her, and found himself thinking, unwillingly, of Elena, of the steady, careful way she had once handled every crisis this pack faced, negotiating peace treaties, and healing the wounded, and never once, in 3 years, causing the kind of chaos that had now become routine under Lyra's unstable gift. He pushed the thought away as soon as it surfaced, uncomfortable with where it might lead if he allowed himself to follow it too far. "We will find a way to manage it," Damien said, though the words felt increasingly like a promise he no longer believed he could keep. "I will not abandon you, Lyra. You are my mate, and this pack's fortunes are your fortunes now." Lyra's expression softened slightly at this, though a shadow of doubt remained behind her eyes, and Damien left her quarters that evening carrying a weight that had grown far heavier than he had ever anticipated, on the night he had so confidently declared her the stronger, more valuable choice. It was 3 weeks later, while Damien sat alone in his private study reviewing the pack's dwindling resources, that Garrick arrived with news that made the mounting pressures of the previous year feel suddenly, sharply insignificant in comparison. "My lord," Garrick said, closing the study door carefully behind him, "word has reached us from traders traveling the northern trade routes. There is talk of a new power rising beyond the mountains, in territory long believed uninhabited." Damien looked up from his papers, frowning. "What kind of power?" "The traders speak of a hidden kingdom," Garrick said, his voice carrying a note of careful uncertainty, as though he himself was not entirely sure whether to credit the rumors he had heard. "A bloodline thought extinct for generations, resurfacing under new leadership. They call it the Lycan territory, my lord, and they speak of a new queen who has risen to lead it, a queen whose strength, according to the stories, rivals anything seen in our lifetime." The word Lycan struck Damien with an unexpected weight, memories stirring of old lessons from his own childhood training, stories of a fearsome bloodline his ancestors had once fought a long and costly war against, a bloodline he had always assumed, along with most of the wider shifter world, had vanished entirely from existence generations ago. "That cannot be accurate," Damien said, though something uneasy had already begun to settle in his chest. "The Lycans were wiped out. Every history I have ever studied confirms it." "I would have agreed with you a month ago, my lord," Garrick said. "But the traders are consistent in their accounts, and traders rarely agree on details unless there is genuine substance behind the stories. Something is happening beyond the northern mountains, something significant enough that entire trade routes are shifting to avoid whatever territory this new queen now controls." Damien sat with this information for a long moment, an uneasy feeling growing steadily within him that he could not fully explain, some instinct warning him that this news, whatever its true substance, would eventually touch his own kingdom in ways he was not yet prepared to understand. "Keep me informed of anything further you learn," Damien said finally, "and send scouts, quietly, to gather what information they can, without drawing attention. If there truly is a new power rising in the north, I want to know everything about it before it becomes a problem I am forced to address without warning." Garrick nodded and departed, leaving Damien alone once more with his papers and his mounting unease, and it was in the quiet of that empty study, staring at columns of numbers that told an increasingly grim story of his kingdom's fortunes, that Damien allowed himself, for the first time in nearly 2 years, to think directly and honestly about the night he had ended his bond with Elena Marsh, in front of the entire pack. He had told himself many things in the months following that decision. that he had acted in the kingdom's best interest. That sentiment had no place in matters of leadership and strategy. That Elena, however loyal and capable she had been, simply could not offer what a growing kingdom required to remain secure against the uncertain dangers of the wider shifter world. He had believed those justifications, or told himself he believed them, for long enough that the guilt had mostly settled into something manageable, something he could push aside during the daily business of ruling his territory. But watching his kingdom's resources drain steadily away under the weight of Lyra's unstable gift, watching his council grow increasingly uneasy with decisions he had once made so confidently, Damien found the old justifications ringing hollow in a way they never had before. Elena had negotiated peace with 3 neighboring territories without a single conflict escalating beyond words. Elena had healed the pack's wounded through 2 brutal winters, without losing a single life to infection or exposure. Elena had never once, in 3 years at his side, caused the kind of damage and uncertainty that had become routine under the mate he had chosen instead. He wondered, sitting alone in the quiet study, with the candles burning low around him, where Elena had gone after the guards escorted her from Ashgrove territory that night. He wondered whether she had found somewhere safe, some new pack willing to overlook her lack of a formal gift and recognize the genuine strength of character that Damien himself had once valued deeply, before ambition and fear of appearing weak had convinced him to discard it in favor of raw power he had believed, wrongly it now seemed, would serve his kingdom better. He did not yet know, sitting there in the candlelight with his uneasy thoughts and his mounting doubts, that the very rumors Garrick had brought him that evening concerned the woman he had cast aside, that the new Lycan queen whose strength was already becoming legend among traders and travelers along the northern routes was Elena Marsh herself, transformed by 2 years of training and discovery into something far more powerful than the pack he had once ruled could easily withstand. He would learn soon enough, and when that knowledge finally arrived, it would arrive not through rumor or traders' gossip, but through Elena's own presence, standing at the gates of the very territory that had once cast her out, no longer the broken, exiled wolf she had been on the night of her rejection, but a queen in her own right, come to see for herself exactly what remained of the kingdom that had chosen ambition over loyalty, and paid, steadily and painfully, the price of that choice ever since. Within the hidden Lycan sanctuary, meanwhile, Elena spent her final weeks of preparation gathering not an army bent on destruction, but a careful, deliberate strategy, built on the lessons of restraint and justice she had learned so thoroughly over the past 2 years. She met daily with Nora and Callum, mapping out the political landscape of Ashgrove territory, as it had been reported by scouts and travelers, identifying which pack members might welcome change, which alliances Damien's kingdom had grown dependent upon, which vulnerabilities his mounting resource losses had already begun to create. "You do not intend to attack them directly," Callum observed one evening, studying the careful notes Elena had compiled across weeks of planning. "No," Elena said. "I intend to show them exactly what they are missing, and let the truth do the work that violence never could." Nora, seated nearby, watched Elena with an expression of quiet approval. "The queen chose well," she said. "2 years ago, the wolf we pulled from that forest might have wanted nothing more than vengeance. You have become someone capable of wanting justice instead. That difference will matter more than you may yet realize, once you stand before Damien Ashgrove again." Elena nodded, feeling the truth of the words settle into her chest alongside the steady, familiar resolve that had carried her through 2 years of transformation. Soon, she knew, she would stand once again within the borders of the kingdom that had cast her aside, no longer wearing a torn white dress and carrying nothing but grief, but wearing the crown of a bloodline the world had believed extinct, ready at last to show Damien Ashgrove precisely what he had chosen to throw away. The gates of Ashgrove territory had not seen a formal procession in years, and the guards stationed along the border stones nearly dropped their weapons when the tree line at the edge of the forest parted to reveal a company of cloaked riders emerging in perfect, disciplined formation, silver eyes gleaming beneath dark hoods, moving with a controlled, deliberate grace that made every instinct in the guards' bodies flatten in unconscious respect. At the center of the formation rode Elena Marsh, though the wolf sitting tall and composed atop her dark mount bore only a distant resemblance to the woman who had once been dragged, sobbing, from these very gates 2 years earlier. Her cloak was the deep black of the Lycan royal guard, trimmed with silver thread that caught the afternoon light, and the circlet resting against her brow marked her, unmistakably, as someone who commanded far more than a simple traveling party. "Halt," one of the border guards called out, his voice cracking slightly with nerves he could not fully hide. "State your business within Ashgrove territory." Elena brought her mount to a stop several paces from the border stones, the same stones where she had once stood alone in a torn white dress, staring into a dark forest with nowhere left to go. The memory rose sharply within her, but she let it pass through her without disturbing the calm composure she had spent 2 years building. "I am Elena, Queen of the Lycans," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the open ground between them, steady and unhurried. "I request an audience with Alpha King Damien Ashgrove." The guard's eyes widened, recognition flickering across his features, and Elena watched the exact moment he placed her face against some distant memory, some half-forgotten glimpse of a young woman who had once served this pack before being cast aside in front of the entire community. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again, before he finally found words. "Elena?" he said, disbelief coloring his voice. You cannot be." "I am precisely who I say I am," Elena replied, not unkindly, though there was steel beneath the calm surface of her words. "Please inform your king that the Lycan Queen has arrived and wishes to speak with him. I trust he will find the time." Word spread through Ashgrove territory faster than any messenger could have carried it, wolf to wolf, whispered across training yards and healing houses and the marketplace stalls that lined the central pathway through pack grounds, until by the time Elena's formation reached the outer edge of the Great Hall, a substantial crowd had gathered along the path, watching with a mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and in some cases, unmistakable hope. Elena recognized many of the faces in that crowd, pack members she had healed during hard winters, wolves she had trained alongside in the sparring yards, the same community that had stood silent 2 years ago while guards marched her toward exile. She did not hold their silence against them now, understanding as she did the particular kind of fear that kept ordinary wolves from challenging the decisions of an alpha king. But she noticed too the way many of them looked at her now with something closer to wonder than the pity or discomfort she might have expected, and she understood that whatever story had reached Ashgrove territory about the rise of a new Lycan queen, the wolves gathered here had already begun to suspect the truth long before her formation arrived at their gates. Damien met her at the entrance to the Great Hall, and Elena watched carefully as recognition dawned across his features, watched the moment his composed, authoritative expression cracked slightly beneath the weight of genuine shock. He had aged in 2 years, she noted, lines of worry etched more deeply around his eyes than she remembered, his shoulders carrying a tension that had not been there on the night he stood so confidently at the center of the candlelit hall. "Elena," he said, and her name in his voice carried none of the cold finality it had held 2 years earlier, only a kind of stunned uncertainty that Elena found, to her mild surprise, did not stir the anger within her that she might have expected. "You are—" The reports we received spoke of a Lycan queen, but I did not imagine that the Lycan queen might be the woman you cast out of these gates 2 years ago," Elena finished for him, her tone level, neither cruel nor gentle, simply matter-of-fact in a way that seemed to unsettle Damien more than open hostility might have. "I understand the surprise. I confess I did not imagine it either, on the night your guards escorted me into that forest." A tense silence stretched between them, the gathered crowd watching with rapt attention, and Damien seemed to search for words that would not come easily, his usual confident authority visibly faltering under the weight of this unexpected reunion. "Will you come inside?" he said finally. "Whatever brings you here, I would rather we speak somewhere more private than the entrance to my hall." Elena considered this for a moment, weighing the value of a private conversation against the strategic advantage of allowing the gathered pack members to witness whatever unfolded between them. She had come here with a careful plan, built across weeks of preparation with Nora and Callum, and part of that plan required the truth of Ashgrove's decline to become visible to the very people who lived within its consequences every day. "I have no objection to speaking privately," Elena said, "but I believe some of what I have to say concerns your entire pack, not only its king. Perhaps it would be more honest, Damien, to hold this conversation where everyone gathered here can hear it." Something flickered across Damien's face, a flash of the old pride that had once driven him to reject her so publicly, but it faded quickly, replaced by something closer to weary resignation. Whatever authority he had once commanded so effortlessly, 2 years of mounting crisis had clearly worn much of it away. "Very well," he said. "Speak then, and let my pack hear what you have come to say." Elena dismounted, her Lycan guard remaining mounted and watchful around the perimeter of the gathered crowd, and walked toward Damien with the same steady, unhurried composure she had carried since arriving at the border stones. She stopped a respectful distance from him, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to make clear she no longer stood as a supplicant before her former mate. "2 years ago," she began, her voice carrying easily across the silent crowd, "I stood in your great hall believing myself weak, unworthy, lacking whatever gift a true queen required to stand beside an alpha king. I have since learned that belief was built on a lie, one hidden from me my entire life without my knowledge. I carry Lycan blood, Damien, the very bloodline your ancestors once fought to erase from this world entirely." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, disbelief and astonishment mingling in equal measure, and Elena watched Damien's expression shift through several distinct stages of realization, the pieces of the rumors he had received clearly falling into place before her eyes. "The Lycans," he said slowly, "were destroyed generations ago. Everyone believes it." "Everyone was meant to believe it," Elena said. "It kept what remained of our bloodline safe, hidden from packs who might have finished what your ancestors began. I did not know the truth of my own blood until the night your guards left me for dead in the forest beyond these gates, and the wolves who found me discovered what neither you nor I had ever suspected." Damien's jaw tightened, and Elena saw the calculation working behind his eyes, the king's instinct to assess threats and alliances, even in the middle of what was clearly a deeply personal reckoning. "If you sought only to inform me of what you have become, a messenger could have carried that word without you needing to appear at my gates yourself. I have come," Elena said, "because word has reached the Lycan territory of the troubles facing your kingdom, failing harvests, damaged property, a resource crisis that grows more severe with each passing season, driven largely, I am told, by the unstable gift of the mate you chose over me." The words landed heavily across the gathered crowd, and Elena watched Lyra emerge from the entrance of the great hall behind Damien, drawn by the commotion, her face draining of color as she took in the scene before her. 2 years had changed Lyra as well, Elena noted, the confident, satisfied smile she remembered from the night of the rejection, replaced by something far more haggard, worn thin by whatever struggles had accompanied her unstable gift over the intervening time. "Elena," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper, disbelief, and something that might have been shame mingling in her expression as she stared at her sister. Elena turned to face her, and for a moment, the two sisters simply looked at each other across the gathered crowd. 2 years and an entire lifetime of complicated history hanging in the silence between them. "Hello, Lyra," Elena said finally, her voice carefully neutral, betraying neither the old anger nor any false warmth she did not feel. "It seems your gift has proven rather more difficult to master than you believed on the night you helped cast me out of this pack." Lyra flinched visibly at the words, and Damien stepped slightly forward, an old protective instinct surfacing despite the tension of the moment. "Whatever grievance you carry, Elena, I would ask you not to humiliate her in front of the pack the way you humiliated me," Elena finished, and though her voice remained calm, there was an unmistakable edge beneath it now, sharp enough to make Damien fall silent. "I understand the instinct to protect your mate, Damien. I once felt the same instinct toward you, before I learned exactly how little that loyalty was worth in your eyes. But I did not come here today to humiliate anyone. I came to see for myself whether the rumors of your kingdom's decline were accurate, and to determine what, if anything, I intend to do about it." A tense silence held the crowd. Every wolf gathered, clearly aware that they were witnessing something far larger than a simple reunion between former mates, something that would reshape the balance of power between two territories, in ways none of them could yet fully predict. "What do you intend to do?" Damien asked finally, and Elena heard, beneath the careful control of his voice, a note of genuine uncertainty, perhaps even fear, that she had never once heard from him during their 3 years together. Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing her answer carefully, thinking of the vision she had seen in the stone basin, of the choice she had made to help even those who had wronged her, guided not by revenge, but by a deeper commitment to justice and the well-being of wolves, who had never done anything to deserve the suffering her sister's unstable gift had caused them. I intend, Elena said, to spend some time within your territory, observing exactly how deep the damage runs, and speaking with the pack members who have borne the cost of your choices these past 2 years. What I decide to do beyond that will depend entirely on what I find. I would ask that you grant my party lodging within your borders while I conduct this assessment, as a matter of courtesy between neighboring rulers, if nothing else. Damien hesitated, clearly aware that refusing such a request in front of his own gathered pack, many of whom were already watching him with new and uncomfortable scrutiny, would only deepen the cracks already forming in his authority. Of course, he said finally. You are welcome within Ashgrove territory, Elena, for as long as you require. Thank you, Elena said, inclining her head with a formality that felt, to everyone watching, distinctly different from any warmth she might once have shown him. She turned to address her waiting guard, issuing quiet instructions for their lodging arrangements, and as the formation began to disperse toward the guest quarters near the edge of pack grounds, she caught sight of the elderly pack member, who had once mouthed an apology to her on the night of her exile, standing now at the edge of the crowd, with tears openly running down her weathered face. Elena crossed to her without hesitation, ignoring the surprised murmurs that followed her movement, and took the old woman's hands gently in her own. You remember me, Elena said softly. I never forgot you, the old woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. I prayed every night that you had found safety somewhere. I never imagined you would return to us like this. I am glad to see you well, Elena said, and meant it fully, feeling something warm cut through the careful composure she had maintained since arriving at the border stones. Whatever happens in the days ahead, know that I have not forgotten the kindness you showed me, even in that terrible moment. The old woman squeezed her hands tightly before releasing them, and Elena turned to follow her guard toward the guest quarters, aware of Damien's eyes still fixed on her from across the courtyard, aware of Lyra standing pale and shaken beside him, aware that the careful, deliberate work of uncovering exactly what had happened to this kingdom in her absence was only just beginning. The guest quarters Damien provided sat near the edge of Ashgrove territory, a modest stone building that had once housed visiting dignitaries during more prosperous years, and Elena spent her first evening there reviewing reports her Lycan guard had already begun gathering from quiet conversations across the pack grounds. Nora sat across from her at a small wooden table, sorting through notes with the same careful precision she brought to every task. The picture grows clearer with each conversation, Nora said, spreading several pages across the table between them. The fires from Lyra's unstable gift account for perhaps half the pack's losses. The other half traces back to something far more troubling. Elena leaned forward, studying the notes. What have you found? A pattern of trade agreements, negotiated over the past year, that consistently favor a merchant consortium based in the Southern Territories, Nora said. Agreements signed not by Damien directly, but through a series of intermediaries, connected, according to several sources within the pack, to your sister. Elena felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Lyra has been making trade deals behind Damien's back? It appears so, Nora said, and not favorable ones for Ashgrove. The pack has been selling resources at prices well below market value, resources they can scarcely afford to lose given the ongoing damage from the fires, while the Southern Consortium profits considerably from the arrangement. Several pack members who handle the territory's trade records grew suspicious months ago, but none dared raise the concern directly, given Lyra's position as the king's mate. Elena sat back, absorbing this information slowly, feeling old, complicated emotions stir within her chest. She had spent 2 years working to release the bitterness she once carried toward her sister, guided by the lessons of restraint and justice she had learned so carefully within the Lycan sanctuary. But learning that Lyra's betrayal had not ended with the rejection ceremony, that it had continued quietly and destructively, in ways that harmed an entire pack of wolves who had done nothing to deserve it, reignited something sharp and unforgiving within her. Why would she do this? Elena asked, though even as she spoke the question, an uncomfortable suspicion was already forming in her mind. What could she possibly gain from weakening the very kingdom she fought so hard to rule? That, Nora said, is a question I believe only your sister can answer honestly. But I suspect, based on what my scouts have gathered, that the consortium in question has been offering her something in exchange for these arrangements, something beyond simple trade goods. What kind of something? Nora hesitated, choosing her words carefully. There are rumors of a healer within the Southern Consortium's employ, one who claims expertise in stabilizing volatile shifter gifts. Rumors suggest your sister has been paying this healer privately for treatments meant to control her fire, treatments that have not, based on the continued incidents, proven particularly effective. Elena absorbed this slowly, a different kind of understanding beginning to take shape. Lyra had not betrayed her pack out of simple greed or malice then, but out of the same desperate fear that had likely driven her ambition from the very beginning. A fear of being exposed as inadequate, as dangerous, as unworthy of the position she had fought so hard to claim. It did not excuse the harm she had caused, but it complicated the anger Elena had carried toward her sister in ways she had not fully anticipated. "I want to speak with her," Elena said finally, "alone, if possible." Nora studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I will arrange it. Though I would advise caution, Elena. Whatever desperation drives your sister's choices, desperate wolves are not always predictable, and you have not seen her in 2 years." The meeting took place 2 days later, in a quiet corner of the Pax healing house, chosen deliberately for its distance from the central gossip that had begun spreading rapidly through Ashgrove territory, as word of the Merchant Consortium's exploitative arrangements finally reached wider ears. Lyra arrived looking pale and drawn, the confident posture Elena remembered from their childhood almost entirely absent, replaced by a guarded, defensive tension that made her seem smaller than Elena remembered. "You wanted to speak with me," Lyra said, settling onto a stone bench across from Elena, her eyes not quite meeting her sister's. "I have learned some things," Elena said, choosing her words carefully, watching for Lyra's reaction, "about trade agreements made with a Southern Consortium. Agreements that have cost this pack far more than they gained, while a certain healer within that consortium's employ received substantial private payments." Lyra's face drained of what little color it had held, and for a long moment she said nothing, staring down at her own hands where they twisted together in her lap. "How long have you known?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible. "I learned 2 days ago," Elena said. "Why did you do it, Lyra? What did you hope to gain by weakening your own pack's resources?" Lyra looked up then, and Elena was startled by the raw, unguarded despair visible in her sister's eyes, so different from the cold satisfaction she remembered from the night of the rejection ceremony. "I was trying to fix myself," Lyra said, her voice breaking. "Do you understand what it has been like, Elena? Every incident, every fire, every whisper behind my back wondering when the next disaster will strike? I promised Damien I would be the strength this kingdom needed, and instead, I have become its greatest liability. I would have done anything to fix that, anything to stop being the reason this pack suffers. Even betray the very pack you claimed you wanted to protect?" Elena asked, though her voice had softened slightly despite herself. "I told myself it was temporary," Lyra said. "That once the treatments worked, once I finally learned to control my gift properly, I could quietly repair the damage before anyone discovered the arrangements. I never meant for it to go on this long. I never meant for it to cost this much." Elena studied her sister for a long moment, weighing the genuine remorse visible in Lyra's expression against the very real harm her choices had caused. The burned grain stores and injured pack members, and drained resources that had pushed an entire community toward genuine crisis. She thought of the vision in the stone basin, of the choice she had made to help those who had wronged her, not out of forgiveness alone, but out of a deeper commitment to justice that considered the well-being of everyone affected, not only the satisfaction of her own grievances. "The healer's treatments have not worked," Elena said. "Have they?" Lyra shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "No. If anything, they have made the incidents worse. I do not know what else to try. I do not know how to stop being this." Elena sat in silence for a long moment, listening to her sister's quiet weeping, feeling the old anger she had carried for 2 years slowly reshape itself into something more complicated. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "I may be able to help," Elena said finally, and watched Lyra's head snap up, disbelief and desperate hope warring across her tear-streaked face. "The Lycan sanctuary has trainers far more experienced with volatile gifts than any healer this Southern Consortium employs. If you are willing to be honest, completely honest, with the Council, about the arrangements you made, I will consider bringing you to the sanctuary for proper training." "Why would you help me?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling. "After everything I did to you." Elena thought of Damien's desperate plea within the vision, of her own answer, chosen not because either of them deserved her forgiveness, but because the wolves who suffered under their choices deserved better than to continue suffering indefinitely. Because holding on to anger toward you has already cost me 2 years I will never get back, Elena said honestly. And because whatever happened between us, you are still my sister, and I would rather see you learn to control your gift properly than watch this pack continue to suffer for your mistakes. Lyra broke down completely then, and Elena found herself crossing the small distance between them, wrapping her arms around her sister for the first time in over 2 years, feeling the old, complicated love beneath the anger and betrayal finally surface again, changed but not entirely destroyed by everything that had happened between them. The confession Lyra made before the Ashgrove Council 3 days later sent shockwaves through the entire territory. Details of the exploitative trade agreements and the private payments to the Southern Consortium's healer laid bare before the very pack members who had suffered the consequences of those choices for over a year. Damien sat at the head of the council table throughout the confession, his expression carefully controlled, though Elena, watching from a respectful distance at the edge of the chamber, could see the storm of complicated emotion moving behind his eyes. "You knew nothing of these arrangements?" one of the council elders asked Damien directly, once Lyra's confession had concluded, the question carrying an unmistakable edge of accusation despite its formal phrasing. "I did not," Damien said, his voice tight, with a mixture of anger and something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. "I trusted my mate's judgment regarding her own private affairs. I see now that trust was misplaced." The council chamber fell into uneasy murmuring, and Elena watched several pack members exchange glances that carried a weight of growing discontent that had clearly been building for months beneath the surface of Ashgrove's daily operations, waiting only for a moment like this one to finally break into open expression. In the days that followed, the full scope of Ashgrove's decline became increasingly visible, not only through the formal council proceedings, but through countless small conversations Elena and her guard conducted across the pack grounds. Wolves who had once been too afraid to speak openly against their king's choices found themselves drawn to Elena's quiet, patient willingness to listen, and stories poured forth of resources mismanaged, of alliances strained by Damien's increasing isolation, of a growing sense among ordinary pack members that their kingdom had lost its way somewhere in the 2 years since Elena's exile. "I remember when you handled the border disputes with the Eastern Territories," one older wolf told Elena during a conversation near the training yards, his voice carrying genuine nostalgia. 3 years without a single conflict escalating to violence. Since you left, we have had 2 skirmishes, and nearly lost an entire trade agreement with our closest ally, over a misunderstanding that could have been resolved with a single careful conversation. The healing house has not had proper leadership since you left either, added a younger wolf, who had trained alongside Elena during her years at Ashgrove. The current healers are competent enough, but none of them ever had your gift for knowing exactly what a patient needed, whether medicine or simply someone willing to listen. Elena absorbed these conversations carefully, aware that each one represented another small crack forming in the foundation of Damien's authority, aware too that her presence within the territory was accelerating a process of disillusionment that had clearly begun long before her return. She had not come to Ashgrove intending to actively undermine Damien's rule, but the truth of his kingdom's decline was becoming impossible to ignore, and word of her own transformation, from exiled outcast to Lycan queen, only sharpened the contrast between what Ashgrove had lost and what it might have become had different choices been made 2 years earlier. It was nearly 3 weeks into her stay when Garrick, Damien's loyal second-in-command, approached Elena privately, his expression carrying a weight of careful consideration that suggested he had thought long and hard before seeking this conversation. "My lord does not know I have come to speak with you," Garrick said, his voice low despite the privacy of the quiet corner where he had found her. "But I have served this pack for over 20 years, Elena, and I have watched it decline steadily since the night of your rejection. I do not believe that decline is coincidence." Elena studied him carefully, uncertain of his intentions. "What are you suggesting, Garrick?" "I am suggesting," Garrick said, "that many of us within this pack have begun to wonder whether Ashgrove's future might be better served under different leadership entirely. Not through violence or rebellion, but through a formal transfer of loyalty, should such an arrangement ever be offered." The weight of the suggestion settled heavily between them, and Elena felt the careful, deliberate strategy she had built with Nora and Callum shifting into new and unexpected territory. She had come to Ashgrove intending to assess the damage and determine what justice required. She had not anticipated the pack's own senior officials approaching her directly with the possibility of defection. "I did not come here to dismantle Damien's kingdom," Elena said carefully. "I came to understand the truth of what has happened here, and to consider what responsibility I might bear toward the wolves who suffer under choices they did not make." "I understand," Garrick said. "But consider this, Elena. The Lycan territory, from everything my scouts have reported, offers strength, stability, and genuine leadership that this kingdom has been missing for 2 years. Many pack members would welcome the opportunity to pledge loyalty to a ruler capable of providing that, rather than continue watching Ashgrove crumble under the weight of choices made in a single, catastrophic night." Elena did not answer immediately, weighing the implications of what Garrick was offering against the careful principles of justice and restraint she had worked so hard to internalize during her training. She thought of the vision in the stone basin, of her promise to help even those who had wronged her, guided by the well-being of the wolves who bore no responsibility for their leader's failures. "I will consider what you have said," Elena told him finally. "But whatever happens, Garrick, I want you to understand that I have not returned to this territory seeking to punish Damien through the slow erosion of everything he has built. If change comes to this pack, I want it to come honestly, through the genuine will of the wolves who live here, not through manipulation or quiet conspiracy." Garrick nodded slowly, respect evident in his weathered expression. "That is precisely why so many of us trust you, Elena. You have not changed in the ways that matter most, whatever crown you now wear." As the weeks passed and Ashgrove's troubles continued mounting, further compounded by the public revelation of Lyra's failed negotiations, Elena found herself increasingly aware that the kingdom balanced on the edge of a transformation that would soon demand direct action, rather than quiet observation. Damien, for his part, grew visibly more strained with each passing day, his authority steadily eroding beneath the combined weight of resource losses, public scandal, and the unmistakable comparison every conversation seemed to draw between his current struggles and the stability Elena had once provided so effortlessly. It was on a cold evening near the end of her 3rd week in Ashgrove territory that Damien finally sought Elena out directly, finding her alone near the edge of the training yards where she had once spent countless hours preparing for a future that had never arrived as she expected. "I know what my pack has been saying about you," Damien said, approaching slowly, his usual confident bearing replaced by something closer to weary resignation. "I know what they have been saying about me, in comparison." Elena turned to face him, studying the tired lines etched across his familiar features, feeling a strange mixture of old affection and hard-won distance settling within her chest. "What do you want, Damien?" "I want to understand," he said, "what you intend to do. You have spent 3 weeks within my territory, uncovering truths I should have discovered myself long before you arrived. My council grows restless. My senior officials speak with you more freely than they speak with me. I would rather hear directly from you what comes next than continue watching my kingdom unravel through rumor and speculation." Elena considered him for a long moment, weighing everything she had learned during her weeks within Ashgrove's borders, everything the wolves of this territory had shared with her about their hopes and their disillusionment, everything her own careful principles demanded of her as she decided what justice truly required. "I think," Elena said slowly, "it is time we spoke honestly with each other, Damien. Not as former mates, and not as rival rulers circling each other with careful strategy. As 2 leaders who each bear responsibility for what has happened to this territory, and who must decide together what happens next." Damien studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his tired eyes, and finally he nodded, the gesture carrying the weight of a man who understood, at last, that the reckoning he had avoided for 2 years could no longer be postponed. They spoke that night in Damien's private study, the same room where he had sat weeks earlier absorbing Garrick's news of a rising power in the north, never suspecting the queen those rumors described would soon be sitting across from him, calm and composed, waiting for him to find the words he had avoided for 2 long years. "I made a mistake," Damien said finally, breaking a silence that had stretched long enough to grow uncomfortable. "I do not say this lightly, Elena. I have spent 2 years telling myself the choice I made that night was necessary, that a king cannot afford to let sentiment guide decisions that affect an entire kingdom's survival. I no longer believe that justification holds the weight I once gave it. Elena watched him carefully, searching his familiar face for the calculation she had grown accustomed to expecting from him, the careful political instinct that had once made her wonder, even during their years together, how much of his affection had been genuine, and how much had simply served his ambitions. She found, to her mild surprise, something that looked far more like honest regret than strategic maneuvering. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I am out of options," Damien admitted, and there was a rawness to the confession that Elena had never once heard from him during their years together, when his confidence had seemed as unshakable as the mountain stone this territory was built upon. "Not slowly, either. The Southern Consortium your investigation exposed has already begun demanding repayment for arrangements Lyra made, without proper authority. Arrangements that never should have been legally binding, but that our own treaty law makes difficult to simply dismiss. If we cannot pay what they claim we owe, they have threatened to bring the matter before the wider regional council, which would damage what remains of our reputation among every neighboring territory." Elena absorbed this new complication with a frown, understanding immediately the danger it represented. A formal complaint before the regional council could result in sanctions, forced tribute, or worse, an erosion of Ashgrove's sovereignty that would extend far beyond simple resource losses. "How much do they claim you owe?" she asked. "More than this kingdom can currently produce in 2 full seasons of trade," Damien said grimly. "Sela has run the numbers a dozen times, hoping to find some error in the consortium's demands. There is no error. We are simply, and completely, in their debt." Elena sat with this information for a long moment, thinking of the careful principles that had guided her since the vision in the stone basin, the commitment to justice that extended beyond her own grievances, toward the well-being of every wolf who might suffer from a kingdom's collapse. Ashgrove's ordinary pack members, the healers and traders and border guards who had done nothing to deserve the consequences of Lyra's desperate choices, stood now at the edge of a crisis that could unravel everything, and Elena found she could not simply walk away and let that happen, regardless of the history that had once driven her from these gates in disgrace. "The Lycan territory holds considerable resources," Elena said slowly, the shape of a decision forming even as she spoke it aloud. "Resources we have carefully rebuilt across decades of quiet, patient work. I could offer Ashgrove the support needed to settle this debt and stabilize the kingdom." Damien's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Why would you offer that? After everything I did to you?" "Because the alternative is watching an entire pack suffer for choices they had no part in making," Elena said. "But understand me clearly, Damien. Any support I offer will not come without conditions. This kingdom cannot continue under the same leadership that led it into this crisis, without genuine, structural change." "What kind of change?" Damien asked, though something in his voice suggested he had already begun to anticipate the answer. "A formal restructuring of Ashgrove's council, with expanded authority granted to senior officials like Garrick and Sela, reducing the unchecked power that allowed Lyra's private dealings to go unnoticed for so long," Elena said, laying out the terms she had spent the previous weeks quietly considering, drawing on everything she had learned during her time observing the kingdom's troubles. "Proper training and support for Lyra's gift, provided through the Lycan sanctuary rather than unreliable outside sources, and a formal alliance between Ashgrove and the Lycan territory, one that would place your kingdom under a measure of oversight until stability has been genuinely restored." Damien was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched the old pride war visibly, with the desperate need to save his kingdom from collapse. She understood, watching him, that this moment represented perhaps the truest test of how much he had actually changed since the night he had so confidently rejected her in front of the entire pack. "You are asking me to surrender a portion of my authority," Damien said finally. "I am asking you to accept accountability," Elena corrected gently. "The unchecked power you held 2 years ago allowed you to reject a loyal mate on a whim, chasing power you believed would strengthen your kingdom. That same unchecked power allowed your new mate's private dealings to nearly destroy everything you built. Perhaps it is time this kingdom learned to function without concentrating so much authority in the hands of a single wolf, however capable that wolf might believe himself to be." The words landed with visible weight, and Damien was silent for a long time, staring at his own hands where they rested on the desk between them. And when he finally looked up, something had shifted behind his eyes, a hard-won humility that Elena had never once seen from him during their years together. "Very well," he said quietly. "I accept your terms, Elena. Whatever authority I must surrender to save this kingdom, and the wolves who depend on it, I will surrender it." It should have felt like victory, Elena thought later that night, walking alone through the quiet training yards under a sky scattered with stars. And yet the satisfaction she had once imagined feeling in this moment remained strangely elusive. She had come to Ashgrove prepared for confrontation, perhaps even prepared for open conflict, and instead she found herself brokering a careful peace built on accountability, rather than destruction. It was, she reflected, precisely the outcome the vision in the stone basin had shown her, and precisely the kind of leadership the Lycan Queen had recognized in her during that final test 2 years earlier. But the peace, fragile as it was, did not last through the following morning. Elena woke to the sound of raised voices carrying across the pack grounds, and by the time she reached the source of the commotion near the eastern gate, she found a tense standoff already unfolding between Ashgrove guards and a group of unfamiliar wolves, wearing the colors of the Southern Consortium. Their leader, a sharp-featured wolf named Victor Graves, standing at the center of the confrontation, with an expression of cold, calculated menace. "Your king has had ample time to settle his debts," Victor was saying, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, pitched deliberately for maximum humiliation. "My associates grow tired of waiting for payment that never arrives. Perhaps it is time we discussed alternative arrangements, ones that do not depend on Ashgrove's increasingly unreliable treasury." Damien arrived moments after Elena, his expression tightening with barely controlled anger, as he took in the scene before him. "This is not the appropriate venue for these negotiations, Graves. If your consortium has concerns, you may present them through proper diplomatic channels." "Proper diplomatic channels have produced nothing but delays," Victor said, his cold gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd before settling, with sudden sharp interest, on Elena standing near the edge of the assembly. "Though I confess, this visit has already proven more interesting than I anticipated. Word reaches even the southern territories of a Lycan queen rising in the north. I did not expect to find her standing in the middle of Ashgrove's own troubles." Elena met his gaze steadily, refusing to let his calculated attempt at intimidation show any effect on her composed expression. "Whatever business you have with Ashgrove's debts," she said, "I would advise conducting it with considerably more respect than you have shown thus far." Victor's mouth curved into something that might have been meant as a smile, but carried no genuine warmth. "And what interest does the Lycan Queen have in Ashgrove's private financial matters, if I may ask?" "Ashgrove's debts are being settled," Elena said simply. "Through an alliance between our territories, formalized this very morning. Your consortium will receive full payment within the terms already established through proper legal channels. I would strongly advise your associates against any further attempts at intimidation on this territory, or any other under Lycan protection." The threat, delivered in Elena's calm, unhurried tone, carried a weight that made even Victor's confident posture falter slightly, and Elena watched the calculation shift behind his sharp eyes as he reassessed the situation before him, clearly recognizing that whatever advantage he had believed he held over Ashgrove's weakened position had just evaporated entirely. "The Lycan territory," Victor said slowly, "extends its protection to Ashgrove now?" "It does," Elena confirmed, "and I trust your consortium has heard enough about the strength of our bloodline to understand exactly what that protection means for anyone who considers threatening territories under our care." Victor studied her for a long moment, weighing the risk of pressing the matter further against whatever profit remained in the arrangement, and finally, with visible reluctance, he inclined his head in a gesture that carried the barest minimum of respect. "Then I trust the terms of payment will be honored promptly. My associates have little patience remaining for further delay." "They will be honored," Elena said. "Now I would ask that you and your party leave this territory. Your business here is concluded." Victor's party withdrew, though the sharp, calculating glance he cast back toward Elena as he departed left little doubt that the Southern Consortium would remember this confrontation, and Elena found herself wondering, watching them disappear beyond the eastern gate, whether this brief encounter marked the beginning of a new complication, rather than the resolution of an old one. Damien approached her once the crowd had begun to disperse, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of gratitude and lingering shame at having needed her intervention at all. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I do not know how I would have handled that confrontation without your presence." "You would have found a way," Elena said, though she did not fully believe it herself. "But I am glad I was here regardless." As the day wore on, and word of the confrontation with the Southern Consortium spread through Ashgrove territory, Elena found herself increasingly aware of a subtle but unmistakable shift in how the pack regarded her, no longer simply as a returning exile seeking answers about her former home, but as a genuine protector, a queen whose strength had just visibly shielded their kingdom from a threat their own leadership had struggled to manage alone. She noticed the change in the way pack members greeted her, the deference in their bows, the quiet gratitude in their eyes, and she understood, with growing clarity, that whatever formal alliance she and Damien had negotiated the previous night was already becoming something far more significant in the minds of the wolves who called this territory home. It was Lyra who found her that evening, sitting alone near the edge of the training yards, and Elena noted the careful, hesitant way her sister approached, as though uncertain of her welcome, despite the reconciliation they had already begun building over the previous weeks. "I heard what happened with the consortium," Lyra said, settling onto the stone bench beside Elena. "You saved this entire kingdom from a debt my own choices created." "I saved it because the wolves who live here deserve better than to suffer for mistakes that were not their own," Elena said. "Yours included, Lyra. Whatever fear drove your choices, I do not believe you are beyond redemption." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening training yards, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a weight of genuine reflection that Elena had not heard from her sister in longer than she could remember. "Do you think Damien truly believes he was wrong that night at the ceremony? Or does he only regret it now because his choices led to consequences he did not anticipate?" It was, Elena reflected, precisely the question she had been turning over in her own mind throughout the long day, and she found she did not yet have a certain answer. "I do not know," she admitted, "but I suspect we will learn the truth of it soon enough, one way or another." Neither of them could have known, sitting together in the gathering dusk, that the truth would arrive far sooner than either expected, and that the fragile peace Elena had worked so carefully to build across her weeks in Ashgrove territory was about to face its most severe test yet, one that would finally force Damien to prove, beyond any doubt, exactly what kind of leader he had truly become. The signing ceremony for the formal alliance between Ashgrove and the Lycan territory was set to take place 3 days later, in the great hall where Elena had once stood in a white bonding dress and watched her entire future collapse in front of hundreds of witnesses. This time, she would stand in that same hall, not as a rejected mate, but as a queen, extending protection and partnership to a kingdom that had once cast her aside, and the symmetry of it was not lost on anyone who had lived through both moments. Preparations moved quickly through the pack grounds in the days leading up to the ceremony, and Elena found herself increasingly occupied with the details of formalizing terms that would reshape Ashgrove's governance for years to come. It was during one of these preparation sessions, reviewing draft language with Garrick and Sella in a quiet council chamber, that she first noticed something troubling in the careful attention of one particular council elder. Aldrich had served on Ashgrove's council for over a decade, a stern, calculating wolf who had said little during the weeks of Elena's investigation, but had watched every development with an intensity that Elena, focused on the broader crisis facing the kingdom, had not initially registered as unusual. It was Sella who finally brought her concerns directly to Elena's attention, catching her alone after a long afternoon of contract negotiations. "I do not trust him," Sella said quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure they were not overheard. "Aldrich has opposed every reform we have proposed these past weeks, always with careful, reasonable-sounding objections. But the pattern beneath those objections concerns me. He stands to lose considerable influence under the new council structure. I have also noticed him leaving the territory twice this week, unaccompanied, without any official business to explain the absences." Elena absorbed this warning with growing unease, thinking immediately of Victor Graves and the calculating menace she had witnessed in his eyes during their confrontation at the Eastern Gate. "Do you believe he has been in contact with the Southern Consortium?" "I cannot prove it," Sela admitted, "but the timing troubles me greatly. Victor Graves left this territory humiliated, his consortium's leverage over Ashgrove's debts neutralized by our alliance. A wolf like that does not simply accept defeat quietly, and if he has found an ally within our own council, someone with knowledge of the ceremony's timing and security arrangements. She did not need to finish the thought for Elena to understand the danger it implied. Elena called an immediate, private meeting with Nora and Callum, laying out Sella's concerns, alongside everything else they had gathered during their weeks within Ashgrove territory, and by the end of the evening, a careful plan had taken shape, one that would allow the signing ceremony to proceed as planned, while quietly preparing for the possibility of exactly the kind of disruption Sela feared. The day of the ceremony arrived clear and bright, the great hall filled once more with gathered pack members, though this time the mood carried none of the tense uncertainty that had marked Elena's original bonding ceremony 2 years earlier. Instead, a cautious optimism moved through the crowd. Wolves who had spent months watching their kingdom struggle, now gathering to witness what many hoped would mark the beginning of genuine recovery. Elena stood at the center of the hall beside Damien, both of them dressed in formal attire befitting the significance of the occasion, and as the ceremonial documents were laid out before them on a carved wooden table, Elena felt Callum's steady presence positioned discreetly near the hall's main entrance, watching the gathered crowd with the careful attention of a wolf trained to notice anything out of place. The ceremony proceeded smoothly through its opening formalities, Damien speaking with genuine humility about the mistakes of the past 2 years and the reforms his kingdom now committed to, Elena responding with careful, measured words about partnership and accountability, rather than domination or revenge. The gathered crowd listened with rapt attention, and for a moment, Elena allowed herself to believe that the difficult work of the past several weeks was finally reaching its resolution. Then the great hall's side doors burst open, and chaos erupted. Victor Graves entered at the head of a small but heavily armed force, and beside him, to the audible gasp of the gathered crowd, walked Aldrich, his expression set with the grim determination of a wolf who had already committed fully to whatever plan had brought this confrontation into being. "I am afraid," Victor announced, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence that had fallen over the hall, "that this ceremony will not be concluding as planned." Damien stepped forward immediately, his posture shifting into the commanding presence Elena remembered from their years together, though she could see the genuine alarm beneath his controlled exterior. "Graves, this is a direct violation of the terms we negotiated. Whatever grievance you believe you hold, this is not the way to address it." "Grievance," Victor repeated, his cold smile widening. "My consortium extended considerable resources to your kingdom in good faith, only to watch your new queen swoop in and reduce our leverage to nothing through diplomatic maneuvering. I do not accept such losses gracefully, Ashgrove. Fortunately, your own council proved more receptive to reasonable arrangements than you were." Aldrich stepped forward then, and Elena watched the gathered crowd's shock deepen as their own trusted elder confirmed his betrayal openly. "The reforms you have proposed strip this council of the authority it has held for generations," Aldrich said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I will not stand by and watch decades of tradition dismantled because a wolf you once cast out returned wearing a foreign crown." "So you conspired with an outside consortium against your own pack," Damien said, disbelief and fury mingling in his voice. "To preserve your personal authority?" "I conspired to preserve this kingdom's independence," Aldrich shot back. "From both the consortium's debts and from Lycan oversight. Once Graves's forces have removed the threat this false queen represents, Ashgrove will be free to negotiate its own terms, without foreign interference dictating our governance." Elena felt the weight of the gathered crowd's fear pressing against the hall, felt Nora's silent presence shifting subtly closer to her side, and understood with clear, calm certainty that whatever peaceful resolution she had hoped to achieve within these walls had just become considerably more complicated. "You believe armed force will resolve this situation in your favor," Elena said, her voice cutting cleanly through the tense silence, carrying none of the fear that gripped much of the surrounding crowd. "I would reconsider that assumption very carefully, Counselor." Victor's smile did not waver. "The Lycan bloodline has been hidden for generations, my queen. Powerful, perhaps, but untested against a force prepared specifically to counter it. My associates have spent considerable resources studying old accounts of Lycan strength, and I assure you, we have come prepared." He raised a hand, and his armed force began to spread through the hall, positioning themselves between the gathered crowd and the exits, and Elena understood immediately that this had been planned with far more care than a simple attempt at intimidation. Whatever Victor Graves intended, he had come genuinely believing he could overcome the very strength that had humbled him at the eastern gate weeks earlier. "Clear the hall," Elena said quietly to Nora, and her Lycan guard began moving immediately, working to shepherd frightened pack members toward the safest available exits, while Victor's forces, momentarily distracted by the sudden movement, struggled to maintain their positioning. "I would not do that," Victor called out, his composed tone finally cracking slightly with irritation as his careful plan began fraying at the edges. "Any resistance will only prolong what is about to happen here." "What is about to happen?" Elena said, stepping forward to stand directly between Victor's forces and the fleeing crowd, "is that you and your associates are about to leave this territory, one way or another. I would strongly encourage you to choose the way that does not involve genuine harm to anyone in this hall." Victor's expression hardened, and he gestured sharply to his assembled forces, several of whom surged forward at his signal. Elena felt the familiar surge of her Lycan strength rising within her, controlled now in a way it had never been during those early chaotic days of her training, and she moved to meet the advancing threat with the calm, deliberate precision that 2 years of discipline had carefully built within her. The confrontation that followed unfolded swiftly, Elena's enhanced speed and strength allowing her to intercept and subdue Victor's forces one after another, never striking with more force than each situation required, always mindful of the careful restraint her training had instilled so thoroughly within her. She disarmed one attacker with a swift, controlled motion that left him stumbling backward into a stone pillar, caught another's advance, and redirected it harmlessly into the space beside her, moving through the chaos with a controlled grace that seemed almost effortless, despite the genuine danger surrounding her. Callum and the rest of her Lycan guard moved in coordinated support, working to protect the fleeing crowd while systematically neutralizing Victor's remaining forces, and within minutes, the initial chaos of the ambush had given way to a clear, unmistakable shift in the balance of the confrontation. Victor's carefully prepared plan, whatever its intended shape, had not accounted for the true scope of what a properly trained Lycan queen, supported by her own disciplined guard, could accomplish. Aldrich, watching his co-conspirators' forces fall back in disarray, seemed to realize belatedly the magnitude of the miscalculation he had committed himself to, and he began edging toward one of the hall's side exits, clearly hoping to escape the consequences of his betrayal before they caught up with him fully. "Aldrich," Damien called out, his voice carrying a cold fury that Elena had never once heard from him during their years together. "You will not simply walk away from this." The old counselor froze, caught between the exit and the king whose trust he had so thoroughly betrayed, and Elena watched the last of his composure crumble entirely as he understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever future he had envisioned when he agreed to Victor's scheme had just collapsed completely around him. Victor, meanwhile, had retreated toward the hall's main entrance, his remaining forces scattered and subdued around him, and he turned to face Elena directly, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more wary and calculating. "You are stronger than the old account suggested," he admitted, his voice tight with grudging acknowledgement. "I would suggest," Elena said, approaching him with steady, unhurried steps, "that you take this opportunity to reconsider whatever remains of your plans for Ashgrove territory, and any territory under Lycan protection going forward." Victor studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing his rapidly diminishing options, and finally, with visible reluctance, he raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "This confrontation was ill-conceived," he said. "I will withdraw my forces and consider Ashgrove's debts fully settled in exchange for safe passage from this territory." "Agreed," Elena said, "on the condition that your consortium never again attempts to threaten this kingdom, or any territory allied with the Lycan crown, through intimidation or exploitation of any kind." Victor inclined his head stiffly, and Elena watched with careful attention as his remaining forces withdrew from the hall under the watchful eyes of her Lycan guard, the immediate threat finally, genuinely neutralized. Only once the last of Victor's party had departed did the tension holding the hall finally begin to ease, replaced by the stunned, relieved murmuring of pack members, processing everything they had just witnessed. Damien turned to Aldrich, still frozen near the side exit, his expression a complicated mixture of anger and genuine grief at the betrayal of a wolf who had served his counsel for over a decade. Why? He asked simply. After everything, why choose this path? Because I watched this kingdom I helped build for 20 years being reshaped by outsiders, Aldrich said, his voice carrying a bitter, defeated edge now that his scheme had so thoroughly collapsed. Because I could not bear to watch tradition dismantled in favor of a queen this pack once cast out entirely. The tradition you claim to have protected, Elena said quietly, stepping forward, was the same tradition that allowed my rejection to happen in the first place, that allowed unchecked power to nearly destroy this kingdom through Lyra's private dealings, that allowed you to conspire with an outside consortium against your own people, rather than simply voicing your objections through proper channels. Perhaps some traditions deserve to be dismantled. Aldrich had no answer for this, and Damien, after a long, heavy moment of consideration, gestured to the remaining guards to take the former counselor into custody, his voice carrying the weight of a leader who understood, at last, exactly what genuine accountability required, even when it meant confronting the betrayal of someone he had trusted for years. As the hall slowly returned to some semblance of order, the gathered pack members emerging cautiously from where they had sheltered during the confrontation, Elena found herself standing once more at the center of the room, precisely where she had stood 2 years earlier, when her entire world collapsed in front of hundreds of witnesses. This time, though, the eyes turned toward her carried none of the pity or discomfort of that earlier night, only genuine gratitude and a dawning recognition of exactly what kind of protector had returned to their gates. Damien approached her slowly, his expression carrying a weight of complicated emotion that Elena found herself, for the first time since her return, genuinely uncertain how to interpret. "You saved this pack today," he said quietly. "Not once, but for the second time in a matter of weeks. I protected wolves who did not deserve to suffer for choices made by others," Elena said. "That is all I have ever intended to do, Damien, since the day I decided to return to these gates." "I know," Damien said, and something in his voice carried a genuine humility that Elena had never once heard from him during their years together, not even during their most difficult moments as mates. "I only wish I had understood, 2 years ago, exactly what I was choosing to discard." Elena studied him for a long moment, feeling the last remnants of old anger finally settle into something quieter, something closer to simple, clear-eyed understanding. "The past cannot be undone," she said finally, "but perhaps what happens from here can still be shaped into something better, for everyone this kingdom is responsible for protecting." Behind them, the gathered crowd began to settle, and the ceremonial documents, momentarily forgotten in the chaos of Victor's failed ambush, still waited on the carved wooden table at the center of the hall, ready at last to be signed, marking not the destruction of Ashgrove territory that Elena might once have imagined seeking, but the beginning of a new order built on accountability, partnership, and the hard-won wisdom of a queen who had learned, across 2 transformative years, exactly what true strength required. The ceremonial documents were signed that same evening, once the last traces of Victor Graves's failed ambush had been cleared from the Great Hall, and the gathered pack members had settled back into their places, their earlier fear transformed into something closer to reverent attention, as they watched Elena and Damien complete the formal alliance that would reshape Ashgrove territory for years to come. Elena signed her name with a steady hand, the circlet upon her brow catching the candlelight in a way that reminded her, briefly, of the very different ceremony that had unfolded in this same hall 2 years earlier. Then, she had stood in a white dress, hopeful and unsuspecting, watching her future collapse in front of hundreds of witnesses. Now she stood as a queen in her own right, extending protection rather than seeking it, and the weight of that transformation settled over her with a quiet, satisfied clarity that no amount of anger or vengeance could ever have provided. The terms of the alliance, formalized in careful, deliberate language over the following weeks, reshaped Ashgrove's governance in exactly the ways Elena had originally proposed. The council gained expanded authority, with Garrick and Sella taking on formal leadership roles that ensured no single wolf, king or otherwise, could again concentrate unchecked power the way Damien once had. Aldrich's betrayal, thoroughly documented and confirmed through the council's own investigation, resulted in his permanent removal from any position of authority within the territory, a consequence that sent a clear message to any wolf who might consider prioritizing personal power over the well-being of the pack they were meant to serve. Lyra, true to Elena's promise, traveled to the Lycan sanctuary within weeks of the signing ceremony, and Elena accompanied her personally for the journey, watching her sister take in the hidden mountain territory with wide, wondering eyes that reminded Elena sharply of her own first impressions upon waking in that stone chamber 2 years earlier. "It is beautiful," Lyra said quietly, as they walked together through the sanctuary's outer grounds, the same training yards where Elena had once struggled through her earliest lessons in Lycan discipline. "I did not imagine anything like this existed." "Few outsiders ever see it," Elena said. "You are fortunate, in your own strange way, to have the opportunity." Callum took charge of Lyra's training personally, and though the road toward mastering her volatile gift proved neither quick nor easy, the sanctuary's disciplines, built across generations of careful practice, succeeded where the Southern Consortium's unreliable treatments had repeatedly failed. Within a year, the fires that had once threatened to consume Ashgrove's resources had settled into something Lyra could summon and control with genuine confidence, and the incidents that had once plagued the kingdom for months on end became, at last, a chapter of the past, rather than an ongoing crisis. "Do not know how to properly thank you," Lyra told Elena one evening, nearly a year into her training, the two of them sharing a quiet meal near the same great hearth where Elena had once laughed with Petra and Finn during her own earliest months at the sanctuary. "After everything I did to you, you still chose to help me become better than I was. You are my sister," Elena said simply. "That did not stop being true, even during the years I was angriest with you. I am glad you found your way here, Lyra. I am glad we both did." Damien's kingdom, meanwhile, began the slow, steady work of genuine recovery under its newly restructured council, and Elena visited periodically over the following months to ensure the reforms were taking proper root, watching with quiet satisfaction as Ashgrove's fortunes gradually stabilized, its resources carefully rebuilt through the disciplined guidance of leaders who had learned, through hard and costly experience, exactly what genuine accountability required. Damien himself changed considerably during this period, the proud, confident king who had once so casually discarded a loyal mate in front of hundreds of witnesses, giving way to someone humbler, someone who listened more carefully to his counsel's counsel and made fewer decisions based on ambition alone. Elena watched this transformation with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and lingering distance, understanding that whatever genuine growth Damien had achieved could never fully undo the pain of that original rejection, even as she found herself, gradually, able to work alongside him without the sharp edge of old anger coloring every interaction. "I have often wondered," Damien said to her one afternoon, nearly 2 years after the failed ambush in the Great Hall, the two of them walking together through the training yards, where Elena had once spent countless hours preparing for a future she never anticipated, whether things might have unfolded differently, had I simply trusted what I already had, instead of chasing what I believed I needed. "Perhaps," Elena said, considering the question honestly, "but I have learned, across everything that has happened these past years, that dwelling too long on what might have been rarely serves anyone well. You made a choice, Damien. It caused genuine harm, and I will not pretend otherwise, but it also set in motion everything that led me to discover what I truly was, to build the strength and purpose I now carry. I cannot fully regret a path that led me here, however painful its beginning." Damien nodded slowly, and something in his expression suggested he understood, at last, that whatever forgiveness Elena extended toward him now was not born of forgetting what had happened, but of a hard-won peace that no longer required punishing him further to feel genuinely complete. The Lycan territory itself flourished under Elena's leadership during these years, its careful, patient work of rebuilding across decades finally beginning to bear fruit in ways the hidden bloodline had not experienced in generations. Word of the new Lycan queen and her thoughtful, disciplined governance spread gradually across the wider shifter world, no longer through fearful whispers of an ancient, forgotten bloodline, but through genuine respect for a ruler who had proven, time and again, that true strength required wisdom and restraint far more than it required raw, unchecked power. Other territories, hearing of Elena's role in stabilizing Ashgrove and neutralizing the threat Victor Graves's Southern Consortium had represented, began cautiously reaching out to establish their own alliances with the Lycan crown, and Elena, guided always by the careful principles she had learned during her 2 years of training, and the vision that had shown her exactly what kind of leader she wanted to become, approached each new relationship with the same thoughtful balance of strength and compassion that had defined her return to Ashgrove from the very beginning. Nora remained close at Elena's side throughout this period, her role expanding from mentor and rescuer into trusted advisor, and Petra and Finn, the friends who had trained alongside Elena during her earliest days at the sanctuary, grew into capable leaders in their own right, taking on expanded responsibilities within the Lycan Guard as the territory's influence continued to grow. On a clear evening nearly 3 years after the night Elena had first stood exiled at the border stones of Ashgrove territory, she found herself once again standing in that same spot, though this time by choice rather than desperate necessity, gazing out at the dark line of forest where her entire transformation had begun. The white bonding dress she had worn on the night of her rejection had long since been discarded, replaced by the dark, silver-trimmed cloak that marked her now as Queen of the Lycans, and the frightened, heartbroken young woman who had once wept beneath an old oak tree, certain her life had ended before it had truly begun, felt like a distant memory belonging to someone else entirely. Nora found her there, watching the darkening tree line with an expression of quiet, contemplative peace. "You are thinking of that night," Nora observed, settling beside her. "I am," Elena admitted. "It is strange, looking back on it now. That night felt like the ending of everything I had built. I understand now, it was only the beginning." "Do you regret any of it?" Nora asked. "The rejection, the exile, everything that followed?" Elena considered the question carefully, thinking of the strength she had built, the family she had found within the sanctuary's walls, the sister she had helped guide back from the edge of genuine ruin, the kingdom she had helped stabilize rather than destroy, guided by principles she never could have developed without the painful transformation that began on this very spot 3 years earlier. "No," Elena said finally, and she meant it completely. "I would not have chosen this path, but I am grateful for who it made me. I came to this border stone once with nothing left, believing myself weak and unworthy of everything I had once hoped to become. I return to it now, as someone I could never have imagined being, someone who found strength, not through anger or vengeance, but through the patient, difficult work of becoming genuinely, completely herself." Nora smiled, the expression warm in the fading evening light. "The queen who trained you would be proud, Elena." "I know I am." They stood together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, the same stars Elena had once gazed up at during her earliest, uncertain nights within the sanctuary, now scattered brightly above the border stones, where her transformation had first begun. Somewhere beyond the tree line, Ashgrove territory continued its steady recovery under its reformed council, Damien ruling now with genuine humility rather than unchecked ambition, Lyra slowly rebuilding the trust her earlier choices had shattered, an entire kingdom learning, gradually, what it meant to be led with wisdom rather than pride. And here, at the border between what she had once been and everything she had since become, Elena Marsh stood as living proof that the cruelest rejection could become the beginning of an entirely unexpected strength, that a bloodline the world had once believed extinct could rise again not through destruction, but through the patient, unwavering commitment to becoming exactly the kind of leader the world genuinely needed. She had returned to Ashgrove not to destroy what remained of the kingdom that once cast her aside, but to prove, in the truest and most lasting way possible, exactly what that kingdom had lost on the night it chose ambition over loyalty, and exactly what genuine strength could build when guided, always, by compassion rather than vengeance. The Lycan Queen turned at last from the border stones, her cloak catching the rising moonlight as she made her way back toward the mountain sanctuary that had become her true home, carrying with her not the bitterness of the woman once discarded in that candlelit hall, but the quiet, unshakable confidence of a queen who had built, from the very depths of her greatest heartbreak, a legacy that would endure for generations to come.